Welcome to J&M Bedtime Stories, where true crime meets tranquility. Every night we bring you hauntingly fascinating true crime tales, told in a soothing tone designed to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. But here's a little mystery we haven't solved yet. Over 95% of our listeners aren't subscribed. That's right, most of you tuning in right now haven't hit that button. If you enjoy relaxing with a dark tale before bed, help us reach our goal of 10,000 subscribers. Just tap that subscribe button. It's free and it helps us keep the stories coming night after night. Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's get into tonight's cases. Alabama. Tina Watson was a 26-year-old American woman from Helena, Alabama. She had recently married Gabe Watson, a fellow Alabamian and certified rescue diver. The two had met at a local church and shared a love of travel. In October 2003, Tina and Gabe traveled to Australia for their honeymoon. Part of their itinerary included a scuba diving trip on the Great Barrier Reef with a company called Mike Ball Dive Expeditions. On October 22nd, they went diving at the site of the SS Yongala, a popular wreck dive known for its strong currents and vibrant marine life. Despite the potential hazards, Tina had limited scuba experience, and this was her first open water dive outside of her training. Gabe, while certified, was not considered an expert. According to Gabe Watson, shortly after descending, Tina had trouble equalizing her ears and panicked. He said she knocked off his mask and regulator, so he had to surface to get help. When returned, she was already being pulled up by other divers, unconscious. Tina was brought to the surface but could not be revived. Her body sank briefly but was later recovered. Tina's death was initially ruled an accident, but questions quickly emerged. Several dive instructors and witnesses stated Gabe wasn't acting like someone in a panic, nor did he signal for help promptly. The dive computer showed a suspiciously short dive. Photos taken shortly before the dive showed Tina looking cheerful and excited. An autopsy found no clear cause of death, but drowning was the presumed cause. Most notably, Gabe had asked about the dive site's currents and emergency exits in detail beforehand, and back in the US, he had encouraged Tina to change her life insurance policies to make him the sole beneficiary. After years of pressure from Tina's family and the Australian authorities, Gabe was charged with manslaughter in Queensland. In 2009, he pled guilty to a lesser charge of negligent manslaughter and served 18 months of a 4.5-year sentence before being deported to the United States. Back in Alabama, Gabe was indicted for capital murder based on accusations that he had planned the murder in the U.S. before carrying it out abroad. However, in 2012, the judge dismissed the charges due to insufficient evidence, stating the case was based more on suspicion than proof. Many theories persist. Here are a few. Tina had a life insurance policy, and some believe Gabe stood to benefit. Others think it was a tragic accident exacerbated by Gabe's poor decision-making and Tina's inexperience. Though unlikely, some have speculated about unknown medical conditions or other factors. Gabe has since remarried. Tina's family continues to advocate for justice and greater scuba safety awareness. Alaska. The Investor was a 58-foot fishing vessel skippered by 28-year-old Mark Coulthurst of Blaine, Washington. In early September 1982, the investor docked in the small fishing village of Craig, Alaska, on Prince of Wales Island at the end of a salmon season. The town was full of other fishermen wrapping up their work. On September 6, 1982, witnesses saw Mark Colthurst talking with an unidentified man at the dock. Later, around 6 a.m. the next morning, people noticed the investor was missing. At about 4 p.m. on September 7th, the investor was found ablaze and adrift near Fish Egg Island, a few miles away. The fire was intense and only partially extinguished by a rainstorm. When authorities boarded the burned vessel, they found the charred remains of 7 bodies, some so badly burned that dental records had to be used for identification. The 8th body was never found but presumed to have been consumed by the fire. Local police, the Alaska State Troopers, and the FBI were all involved in the investigation. Witnesses in Craig had seen a man, described as in his early 20s with acne and dark hair, piloting the investor's skiff back and forth from the burning boat. He was acting nervously, avoiding eye contact, and had blood on his clothes. Eventually, the investigation led to a suspect, John Kenneth Peel, a 24-year-old former deckhand who had worked briefly for Colthurst the previous year. Peel was from Bellingham, Washington, and matched the description given by witnesses. However, there was no physical evidence, only circumstantial, including a possible motive involving a falling out with Colthurst. Peel was arrested in 1984. His trial, held in 1986, ended in a hung jury. He was tried again in 1988, and after a long, expensive trial, Peel was acquitted of all charges. He maintained his innocence throughout and later sued for wrongful prosecution, eventually settling with the state for $900,000. The investor murders remain officially unsolved. Despite the trials and decades of investigation, no one has been convicted. It's often called one of the worst mass murders in Alaskan history and continues to be the subjects of books, podcasts, and speculation. Arizona. On August 10, 1991, a tragic event unfolded at a Buddhist temple in Waddell, Arizona, resulting in the deaths of 9 individuals. The victims included 6 monks, along with a nun, her nephew, a novice monk, and a temple employee. They were discovered the following morning, arranged face down in a circle, each shot execution style in the back of the head. The investigation began with a tip from Mike McGraw, a patient at a Tucson mental hospital, who named 4 men from Tucson as the perpetrators. These individuals were arrested, and after extensive interrogations lasting up to 20 hours, each provided confessions. However, these confessions were later recanted, and no physical evidence linked the suspects to the crime. This led to the charges being dropped, and the case remained unsolved for several months. In October 1991, during a search unrelated to the temple murders, a .22 caliber rifle was found in a friend's vehicle, leading authorities to Jonathan Duty, Alessandro Alex Garcia, both teenagers from Tucson. Further investigation revealed that the rifle matched the type used in the temple killings. Both teens were arrested, and after prolonged interrogations, confessed to the murders. They claimed to have targeted the temple to steal money, electronics, and jewelry. The confessions obtained from Duty and Garcia were contentious. Critics argued that the lengthy interrogations, which included isolation and intense pressure, led to coerced confessions. The American Civil Liberties Union of Arizona condemned the tactics used stating that the methods employed were improper and could lead to false confessions. Subsequent legal proceedings highlighted these concerns, with appeals courts later ruling that the confessions were inadmissible due to their coercive nature. Despite the issues surrounding the confessions, Duty and Garcia were convicted. Duty, who was 17 at the time of the murders, received a sentence of 249 years in prison. Garcia, 16 at the time, was also convicted and sentenced accordingly. However, in 2011, an appeals court ruled that Duty's confession had been coerced, leading to a retrial. The retrial ended in a hung jury in 2013, and Duty remained in prison. The Buddhist Temple Massacre remains one of the most harrowing events in Arizona history, prompting discussions about interrogation practices, the reliability of confessions, and the potential for miscarriages of justice. The case serves as a poignant reminder of the complexities involved in criminal investigations and the importance of safeguarding the rights of the accused. Arkansas. The deaths of Don Henry and Kevin Ives, often referred to as the Boys on the Tracks, is one of the most infamous and mysterious cases in Arkansas history, marked by controversy, conflicting official accounts, and widespread speculation about possible cover-up involving drugs and corruption. Don Henry, 16, and Kevin Ives, 17, were two teenage boys from Alexander, Arkansas, a small town near Little Rock. On the night of August 22, 1987, they reportedly went out hunting, as they often did, and never returned home. Early morning on August 23, 1987, a train crew saw the boys' bodies laying across the tracks near Bryant, Arkansas. The conductor blew the horn and attempted to stop, but the train could not halt in time and ran over them. The boys were lying side by side, partially covered by a tarp, with their rifles beside them. Initial reports concluded they were in a deep sleep induced by marijuana. State medical examiner Dr. Fahmy Malak ruled the deaths as an accident, claiming they had smoked a large amount of marijuana and passed out on the tracks. This ruling was heavily criticized, as toxicology reports showed the levels of marijuana were not enough to cause unconsciousness. The families fought to reopen the case. A second autopsy performed by Dr. Joseph Burton revealed that Kevin Ives died from a crushed skull and Don Henry had been stabbed in the back before their bodies were placed on the tracks. The case was reclassified as a homicide. Several theories emerged, including some people believed that the boys may have witnessed a drug drop or operation involving local law enforcement or officials and were killed to silence them. The case has been tied by conspiracy theorists to CIA drug trafficking through Maine, Arkansas, a known hotspot during the 1980s. Due to the case occurring during Bill Clinton's time as governor of Arkansas, and connections to controversial coroner Fahmy Malak, political motives and cover-up accusations have persisted. Multiple witnesses have died under suspicious circumstances over the years. Despite several grand jury investigations and ongoing public interest, no one has ever been officially charged with their murders, and the case remains unsolved. California. In the summer of 1969, a series of gruesome murders shocked America, and the nation would soon learn the name Charles Manson, a failed musician, self-proclaimed prophet, and cult leader. But behind Manson stood a group even more chilling, the Manson family. Charles Manson was born in 1934, raised in a turbulent household. and in and out of institutions for most of his youth. By the time he was released from prison in 1967, the summer of love was in full swing, and Manson, he had a plan. He saw the rise of hippie counterculture, free love, psychedelic drugs, and anti-establishment ideals, and used it to craft a following. He presented himself as a guru, a messiah, and even the second coming of Christ. Manson attracted young, vulnerable people, mostly women, many of whom were looking for meaning in a chaotic world. They called themselves the Family. They lived communally, first in San Francisco, then at Spawn Ranch, a rundown film set outside of Los Angeles. They dropped acid, preached love, and listened to Manson's twisted philosophy, one that blended Beatles lyrics, Bible verses, and apocalyptic visions. Manson believed a race war was coming, a prophecy he called Helter Skelter. Manson longed to be a rock star. Through a chance connection, he met a music producer, Terry Melcher, Doris Day's son. But when Melcher rejected him, something inside Manson broke. Fueled by rejection and his delusions of grandeur, Manson gave the order. It was time to spark Helter Skelter. August 8, 1969, Manson sent 4 of his followers, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Crenwell, and Linda Kasabian, to CeeLo Drive. Their instructions: kill everyone inside. Inside was the actress Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, along with 4 others. The murders were brutal, ritualistic, and seemingly senseless. The next night, Manson led another group. This time, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were slaughtered in their home. Words were written in blood on the walls. The Manson family was arrested months later, not for murder, but for car theft. It wasn't until Susan Atkins began talking that the truth unraveled. The 1970 trial was a media circus. Manson carved an X into his forehead. The women, brainwashed and loyal, mimicked him, sang in court, and showed no remorse. Charles Manson was sentenced to life in prison. So were his most loyal followers. But the horrors of their crimes and the twisted charisma that led them there still haunt American history. The Manson family wasn't just a cult. It was a mirror to a dark undercurrent in the American psyche, a reminder that even in an era of peace and love, darkness can arise. Colorado. The Watts family murders were a tragic and shocking crime that occurred in Frederick, Colorado in August 2018. The case drew national and international attention due to the seemingly picture-perfect image of the family and horrifying nature of the crime. Christopher Watts, commonly known as Chris Watts, was married to Shannon Watts. They had 2 young daughters, Bella, 4, and Celeste, 3. Shannon was also 15 weeks pregnant with a baby boy, whom they had planned to name Nico. From the outside, the Watts family appeared happy, with Shannon frequently posting smiling family photos and positive messages on social media. On August 13, 2018, Shannon was reported missing by a friend who had dropped her off early that morning after a work trip and couldn't reach her later in the day. When police conducted a wellness check, they found the home empty and no sign of Shannon or the girls, though Shannon's car and personal belongings were still there. Chris initially told police he had no idea where his wife and daughters were, and gave a series of television interviews pleading for their return. However, inconsistencies in his story, combined with evidence from Shannon's phone, neighbors' security footage, and his own behavior, quickly raised suspicion. After failing a polygraph test on August 15th, Chris eventually confessed to murdering his wife. Initially, he claimed that he had killed Shannon in a fit of rage after she supposedly strangled their daughters, a claim that was proven false. He ultimately admitted to killing Shannon himself after telling her he wanted a separation. He then smothered both of his daughters and transported all three bodies to an oil work site owned by his employer. He buried Shannon in a shallow grave and disposed of the girls' bodies in oil tanks. Investigators discovered that Chris was having an affair with a coworker, and he reportedly wanted to start a new life with her. The affair and his desire to escape his responsibilities were considered the primary motives behind the murder. Chris Watts was arrested on August 15th and later pled guilty to multiple counts of first-degree murder to avoid the death penalty, as requested by Shannon's family. On November 19, 2018, he was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 84 years for unlawful termination of a pregnancy and tampering with a dead body. The case has been the subject of numerous documentaries, interviews, and true crime analysis, including the Netflix documentary American Murder: The Family Next Door, which used archival footage, social media posts, and law enforcement recordings to tell the story. The Watts family murders left a deep impact on the community and continue to be one of the most disturbing examples of family annihilation in recent history. Illinois. The Richard Speck murders, one of the most chilling mass murders in American history, occurred in Chicago, Illinois, on the night of July 13th to 14th, 1966. Richard Benjamin Speck was born on December 6, 1941, in Kirkwood, Illinois. He had a troubled upbringing marked by poverty, abuse, and petty crime. After a series of arrests for burglary and assault, he drifted through jobs and spent time in and out of jail. By 1966, he was 24 years old and already had a long criminal record. Speck had a history of alcohol abuse and increasingly erratic, violent behavior. In early July 1966, Speck arrived in Chicago looking for work. He stayed in cheap lodging houses and tried to get a job as a seaman, which he had done before. After a failed attempt to board a ship and a few days of heavy drinking, Speck spiraled into a mental state that would culminate in one of the most brutal crimes in Illinois history. On the evening of July 13, 1966, Speck broke into a townhouse located at 2319 East 100th Street in the Jeffrey Manor neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. The building housed student nurses from South Chicago Community Hospital, 8 of whom were home that night. Speck entered the house armed with a knife. He claimed he only intended to rob the place, but quickly took control of the women, tying them up and herding them into a room. Over the course of several hours, he methodically took them out of the room one by one, assaulted them, and murdered all but one, who managed to survive by hiding under a bed and remaining silent for hours. Speck used different methods to kill women: stabbing, strangulation, and one was reportedly assaulted. The crime scene was gruesome. The victims were left posed in degrading ways, and there were signs of a sadistic, chaotic frenzy. The lone survivor finally escaped after hiding for hours and alerted the police. The murder stunned Chicago and the nation. The crime was senseless and horrific. Police had a few leads at first, but a composite sketch based on the survivor's description helped. The key break came when a drifter who had shared a room with Speck recognized him from a newspaper sketch and tipped off the police. Speck, who had attempted to end his own life, was found in a seedy hotel room on July 17, 1966. He was taken to Cook County Hospital for treatment, where staff noticed his "Born to Raise Hell" tattoo, a detail that matched the witness description. Speck's trial began in April 1967. The main witness was the lone survivor, who bravely testified and identified him as the killer. The prosecution also presented strong physical evidence, including fingerprints. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 49 minutes before finding him guilty on all counts of murder. He was sentenced to death. However, in 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court abolished the death penalty temporarily, and Speck's sentence was commuted to life in prison. Speck served his sentence at Stateville Correctional Center in Joliet, Illinois. Over the years, he gained notoriety for bizarre behavior in prison, including drug use and a now infamous videotape smuggled out in the 1990s showing him engaged in acts, using drugs, and speaking openly about the murders with chilling indifference. The tape shocked the public and raised serious concerns about the prison system. Richard Speck died of a heart attack on December 5, 1991, one day before his 50th birthday. The murders had a lasting impact on American society. They changed how nursing programs housed students and influenced public attitudes about crime, punishment, and security. The horror of the event, combined with Speck's lack of remorse, made the case one of the most infamous in U.S. criminal history. Indiana. The Delphi murders refer to a tragic and highly publicized case involving the murders of Abigail Abby Williams and Liberty Libby German, two teenage girls from Delphi, Indiana. The case drew national attention due to its chilling circumstances, mysterious evidence, and the long investigation that followed. On February 13, 2017, the two best friends, Abby and Libby, were walking the Delphi Historic Trails, specifically the Monon High Bridge Trail in Delphi, Indiana. The girls were off school that day due to a scheduled day off. They decided to go hiking on the Monon High Bridge Trail, a popular but somewhat remote walking trail. Libby's sister dropped them off around 1:35 p.m. They were supposed to be picked up later that afternoon, but they never arrived at the designated meeting spot. When the girls didn't return, their families became concerned and reported them missing. A large volunteer search party was organized, and on February 14, 2017, their bodies were found about a half a mile from the Monon High Bridge. The exact manner of their deaths was not released initially, and much of the case remains under wraps due to the ongoing investigation. This case stood out due to the critical evidence captured by Libby German on her phone just moments before the girls were believed to have been attacked. There was an audio recording with a male voice saying, "Down the hill," believed to be the suspect. Also, a brief video showing a man walking towards the girls on the bridge, wearing jeans, a blue jacket, and a hat. Libby's quick thinking in capturing this media was hailed as heroic and crucial to the case. Authorities released portions of the audio and video in hopes the public could identify the man. 2 composite sketches were released. The first in 2017 showed an older-looking man. A revised sketch in 2019 depicted a younger man. Police later said both sketches were valid, but focused on the younger appearance moving forward. The case remained unsolved for more than 5 years, despite national media coverage, numerous tips, and even true crime podcast investigations. Multiple people were investigated, but no charges were filed until 2022. In October 2022, a major breakthrough came. Richard M. Allen, a 50-year-old Delphi resident and CVS pharmacy technician, was arrested and charged with the murders. A bullet found near the girls' bodies was later matched to a gun owned by Allen. He also reportedly admitted to being on the Monon High Bridge that day. Allen's appearance matched the man seen in the video clip captured by Libby. He had previously told investigators back in 2017 that he was at the trails that day of the murders, but hadn't been arrested at that time. Allen was formally charged with 2 counts of murder and held without bond. The case took a bizarre turn in 2023 when some of Allen's attorneys introduced a theory involving ritualistic or cult activity. The defense argued that Allen was being framed or that other individuals were involved. Prosecutors, however, stuck to the physical evidence and the confession Allen had reportedly made to fellow inmates. Allen was ultimately convicted and sentenced to 130 years in prison. The Delphi community and the nation closely followed the case. Memorials were established in the girls' honor, and their families continued to advocate for justice. Iowa. The Molly Tibbetts case is one that captured national attention in the United States due to its tragic nature and the public search effort that followed her disappearance. Molly Tibbetts was a 20-year-old University of Iowa student studying psychology. She was known for being kind, friendly, and deeply involved in her community. In the summer of 2018, she was living in Brooklyn, Iowa, a small town where she was staying with her boyfriend's brother and dog while working at a day camp. On the evening of July 18, 2018, Molly went for a run, something she did regularly. Surveillance footage showed her jogging near her neighborhood, but that night she didn't return. Her family and her boyfriend became worried after she failed to show up for work the next day. They reported her missing, and a massive search began. Law enforcement, volunteers, and even the FBI became involved in the search for Molly. For over a month, her case remained unsolved, and her disappearance became national news. In August 2018, investigators reviewed surveillance footage from a local residence. The footage showed a black Chevy Malibu repeatedly circling the area where Molly was running. Investigators traced the car to Christian Rivera, a 24-year-old undocumented immigrant from Mexico who had been working at a dairy farm in the area under a false name. When questioned, Rivera initially denied involvement, but later confessed to following Molly in his car and approaching her. According to Rivera's confession, he approached Molly while she was jogging. She told him to leave her alone and threatened to call the police. He claimed he became angry and blacked out. He later came to and realized she was in the trunk of his car. Rivera led investigators to a cornfield where he had left her body covered with corn stalks. Molly's body was found on August 21, 2018, more than a month after she disappeared. An autopsy revealed that Molly Tibbetts died from multiple sharp force injuries consistent with being stabbed. The death was ruled a homicide. Rivera was charged with first-degree murder. His trial was delayed multiple times, but it finally began in May of 2021. During the trial, prosecutors presented Rivera's confession and evidence linking him to the crime. Rivera took the stand in his own defense and changed his story, claiming two masked men forced him to kidnap Molly and he was coerced into silence under threat to his family. The jury rejected his revised account. On May 28, 2021, Rivera was found guilty of first-degree murder. In August 2021, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The murder of Molly Tibbetts sparked political and public outcry, especially because Rivera was in the U.S. illegally. Some politicians used the case to argue for stricter immigration policies, which drew criticism from Tibbetts' family, who asked that Molly's death not be politicized. Her family focused on remembering Molly for who she was, loving, bright, and compassionate, and emphasized the importance of unity and healing rather than division. Kansas. The Clutter family murders occurred on November 15, 1959, in Holcomb, Kansas, and are among the most infamous crimes in American history. The brutal killings were later immortalized in Truman Capote's 1966 true crime classic, In Cold Blood, which brought national attention to the case. The Clutters were a well-respected and prosperous family in the small farming community of Holcomb. Herbert "Herb" Clutter, 48, was a successful wheat farmer and community leader. He was known for his generosity, strict morality, and being a devout Methodist. His wife, Bonnie Clutter, 45, struggled with depression and health problems. Their daughter, Nancy Clutter, 16, was a bright, popular high school student, active in the Future Homemakers of America, and a talented musician. Their son, Kenyon Clutter, 15, was a quiet boy who enjoyed carpentry and electronics. The Clutters lived in a large farmhouse outside Holcomb. They were the picture of the American dream, hard-working, upright, and close-knit. Dick Hickok and Perry Smith were ex-convicts who met in prison. While incarcerated, Hickok heard from a fellow inmate, Floyd Wells, that Herb Clutter was wealthy and kept a safe full of cash in his house. This turned out to be false. After being released, Hickok convinced Smith to help him rob the Clutter home. On the night of November 14th, they drove across Kansas with the intent to rob and leave no witnesses. The two men broke into the Clutter home in the early morning hours. They bound and gagged the entire family and searched for the non-existent safe. Finding only about $40 in cash, a radio, and a pair of binoculars, the pair debated what to do next. Ultimately, they murdered all four family members with a shotgun and a knife in cold blood. Herb Clutter was found in the basement with his throat cut and then shot in the head. Kenyon was tied to a couch in the basement and shot in the head. Nancy was shot in the back of the head while lying in bed. Bonnie was found in her own bed, also shot in the head. The killings were precise and cold, with each family member murdered in a different room, suggesting careful planning. The murders shocked Holcomb and quickly gained national attention. There were no initial suspects, and the crime scene offered few leads. The case broke open when Floyd Wells, the prison informant, tipped off authorities after learning about the murders. Hickok and Smith had fled to Mexico and later traveled across the U.S. committing small crimes. They were eventually caught in Las Vegas on December 30th, 1959, after authorities tracked their movements using bad checks they had written. Hickok and Smith were tried together in March 1960. Both were found guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. After years of appeals, both men were executed by hanging at the Kansas State Penitentiary on April 14, 1965. Kentucky. The disappearance of Crystal Rogers is one of the most haunting and high-profile unsolved cases in Kentucky, centered in Bardstown, a small town known for bourbon and beauty, and now a string of tragic, mysterious events. Crystal Rogers, a 35-year-old mother of 5, was a well-known resident of Bardstown, Kentucky. By all accounts, she was a devoted mother, known for her outgoing personality and deep love for her children. At the time of her disappearance, she lived with her boyfriend, Brooks Houck, the father of her youngest child and several of her children. Crystal was last seen alive on the night of July 3, 2015. According to her boyfriend, Brooks, they had spent the evening at home playing games on their phones. He claimed he went to bed, and when he woke up, Crystal was gone. 2 days later, on July 5th, her maroon Chevrolet Impala was found abandoned along the Bluegrass Parkway a few miles from Bardstown. The car had a flat tire, and her keys, purse, and cell phone were still inside. Chilling signs that something was very wrong. Suspicion quickly focused on Brooks. He was the last person to see her, and his story had inconsistencies. During questioning by police, he appeared nervous and evasive. Compounding suspicion, he was interviewed with his brother Nick, a Bardstown police officer present, who allegedly interfered with the investigation and later refused a polygraph test. Nick was eventually fired from the department for obstructing the case. Despite the suspicion, Brooks was never immediately charged. He continued to claim innocence and maintained that he had nothing to do with Crystal's disappearance. Crystal's family, especially her mother, Shelley, became relentless advocates for justice. Shelley organized searches, maintained a visible presence in the media, and placed signs and billboards around town demanding justice. Tragedy struck again in 2016 when Crystal's father, Tommy, was shot and killed while hunting with his grandson. The case remains unsolved, but many, including Crystal's family, believe it was connected to Crystal's disappearance and their push for answers. After years of limited movement in the case, the FBI took over the investigation in August 2020. They launched a massive search of properties tied to Brooks and others, including excavation work, digital forensic analysis, and witness interviews. This new push renewed hope in the case. In a major development in October 2023, human remains were discovered in Nelson County. And in August 2023, a man named Joseph Lawson was indicted for conspiracy to commit murder and evidence tampering in connection with Crystal's case. Then, in September 2023, Brooks was finally arrested and indicted for murder and evidence tampering. This was the most significant break in the case in 8 years. Prosecutors alleged that Brooks was directly involved in Crystal's killing, though the details remain under seal pending trial. As of now, Brooks awaits trial, and the community of Bardstown continues to reel from the years of mystery and trauma. The Rogers family remains steadfast in their pursuit of full justice, not only for Crystal, but also for her father Tommy and the broader string of unsolved tragedies in the region. Louisiana. The Axeman of New Orleans is one of the most infamous and mysterious serial killers in American history. His crimes occurred between 1918 and 1919, and he became notorious for his brutal killings and the eerie nature of the attacks. New Orleans, Louisiana, in the early 20th century, was a bustling city with a rich cultural and social life. However, it was also a place where crime was not uncommon, particularly in its immigrant communities, which included a significant population of Italians. The city's police force was not particularly well equipped to handle the level of violence that was about to unfold. The Axeman's reign of terror began in May 1918, and for over a year he would strike at random, killing and maiming victims with an axe while they slept in their homes. His attacks would come without warning, leaving the city in a state of fear and confusion. The first known victims of the Axeman were Joseph and Catherine Maggio, an Italian immigrant couple. On May 23, 1918, they were brutally attacked in their home. The killer broke into their house during the night, using an axe that belonged to the couple. Joseph was murdered with a single blow to the head, and Catherine suffered severe head injuries before dying later from her wounds. The crime scene was gruesome, and there was no sign of robbery or other obvious motives, which perplexed the investigators. After the Maggios, the Axeman continued his rampage across the city. His victims were often Italian American, but it wasn't limited to just one group. The Axeman's method was chillingly consistent. He would break into his victims' homes, usually through a back door, and then bludgeon them while they slept, using an axe or other blunt weapon. Many of the victims were struck in the head and face, leaving gruesome wounds. In some cases, the killer would leave the axe at the scene, leading to speculation that it was not a typical robbery gone wrong. The lack of apparent motive only increased the terror and confusion surrounding the attacks. The most chilling aspect of the Axeman case was the letter that was sent to the local newspaper. On March 13, 1919, a local newspaper received a letter allegedly written by the Axeman himself. The letter reads as follows: Hell, March 13, 1919. Esteemed mortal, the Axeman is the man who is known as the Axeman. I am writing you this letter to tell you that I am very fond of jazz music. When I come to New Orleans, I will spare your life if you play jazz music. If you do not, I will kill you and your family. I am not a monster. I am simply a man who loves music. If you do play jazz, you will be saved. The letter was signed the Axeman. This bizarre communication sparked widespread fear and panic in the city. The Axeman seemed to suggest that he would spare anyone who played jazz music in their homes, creating an unsettling mix of horror and strange humor. Jazz music, which was popular in New Orleans at the time, became the focal point of a public reaction to the letter. In response to the Axeman's letter, many New Orleans residents did indeed hold jazz parties and played jazz music loudly in their homes on the night of March 19, 1919. The night became a kind of communal defiance against the killer. And while no murders were reported that night, it did not lead to the killer's capture or provide any clues about his identity. However, after this letter, the Axeman's killings stopped abruptly. His reign of terror lasted only from May 1918 to October 1919, and there were no murders attributed to him after that period. Some believe that the public response to the letter may have frightened him into stopping, while others speculate that he may have been caught or simply moved away from New Orleans. The identity of the Axeman has remained a mystery. Some believe the Axeman was a serial killer with a personal vendetta, possibly targeting specific individuals. The choice of victims, however, made it seem random. The victims of the Axeman were often Italian Americans, leading some to believe that the killer may have been connected to organized crime. However, no direct link to the mafia was ever proven. Another theory suggests that the Axeman may have been a former victim of a violent crime who sought revenge. It's also possible that the Axeman was simply a mentally unstable individual who became obsessed with the idea of violence and terror. Despite the passing of over a century, the Axeman of New Orleans remains an unsolved mystery. His story is one of the most chilling in the annals of American crime, and his murders still capture the public's imagination. The Axeman inspired songs, books, and films, and his eerie letter to the newspaper remains one of the most memorable aspects of the case. The crime spree itself, marked by its randomness, brutality, and the killer's eerie love of jazz music, continues to haunt the city of New Orleans to this day. Though his identity was never uncovered, the Axeman's impact on the culture of New Orleans endures. It's a case that still sparks fear and curiosity among those who study the darker side of history. Maine. The shooting of Corporal Eugene Cole occurred on the morning of April 25, 2018, in Norridge Walk, a small town in central Maine, and it became a tragic event that drew national attention. Corporal Eugene Cole was a 13-year veteran of the Somerset County Sheriff's Office. He was 62 years old, well respected by his colleagues, and known for his calm demeanor and dedication to law enforcement. On the morning of April 25th, Cole was on routine patrol in Norridge Walk, where he was assigned. At approximately 1 a.m. on April 25, 2018, Cole stopped a vehicle near the Big Apple store in Norridge Walk, which was a common area of law enforcement activity. The driver, later identified as John D. Williams, was acting suspiciously, and there was a brief interaction between the two. Williams had a criminal history, and it's believed that Cole's stop was related to a suspicion of a crime, though the exact reason for the stop wasn't fully clear. Williams, 29 at the time, had recently been involved in a robbery at the Rite Aid Pharmacy in Norridge Walk. He had stolen prescription drugs and was trying to flee the area when Cole approached him. During the stop, Williams ambushed Cole. Williams shot him at close range using a handgun that he had stolen earlier. The details surrounding how Williams obtained the weapon were linked to previous criminal activity, including the robbery. The gunshot that struck Corporal Cole was fatal. After shooting Cole, Williams took his police-issued radio and gun, leaving Cole lying on the ground seriously injured. Williams fled the scene and Corporal Cole was left behind. It was later confirmed that Cole had been shot in the abdomen. The Somerset County Sheriff's Office and local law enforcement responded quickly, realizing that one of their own had been shot. A massive manhunt ensued, involving multiple law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, state police, and local police departments. Williams, who had fled the scene in Cole's police cruiser, was on the run for several days. His movements were tracked to various locations, including areas in the nearby towns of Skowhegan and Fairfield. After several days of searching, Williams was located and apprehended on April 27, 2018, in a wooded area near the town of Norridgewock. He was captured by a team of officers and taken into custody without further incident. During the arrest, Williams was charged with murder, robbery, and other offenses. Williams's trial began later in 2019. He pled guilty to the murder of Corporal Eugene Cole, and he was sentenced to 45 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The case deeply impacted the local community and the broader law enforcement community, as it highlighted the dangers that officers face every day while performing their duties. Corporal Eugene Cole's death was a major loss for Maine law enforcement. He was mourned by his colleagues, friends, and family, with his funeral attended by thousands, including many law enforcement officers from across the country. The incident also sparked conversations about officer safety and the risks faced by law enforcement officers, particularly in rural areas. In the aftermath of his death, his colleagues and the Somerset County Sheriff's Office established memorials in his honor. In addition, the state of Maine and local communities have continued to honor Cole's legacy, ensuring that his service and sacrifice are never forgotten. The shooting of Corporal Eugene Cole remains a somber reminder of the dangers faced by those who serve in law enforcement and the tragic impact that violence can have on communities. Maryland. Felicia Barnes was a 16-year-old African-American high school student from North Carolina. In December 2010, she traveled to Baltimore, Maryland, to visit her half-sister who was living in the area. Felicia had planned to spend the holidays in Baltimore, but she disappeared on December 28, 2010, while staying at her sister's apartment. Felicia's case quickly became a focal point for both local and national news outlets, with authorities and the public desperately searching for clues. On the morning of her disappearance, Felicia was last seen in her sister's apartment building in northwest Baltimore. She was supposed to meet her sister's boyfriend, but she had gone missing by the afternoon. The last confirmed sighting of her was around 10 a.m. After that, there were no more traces of her, and she failed to show up for a planned meeting with her half-sister later that day. Her family became worried, and her sister quickly reported her as missing. As the days passed and there were no signs of Felicia, the search for her intensified. Her case gained widespread media attention. Authorities, along with volunteers, began searching the city, and the family used social media to try to raise awareness about the missing teenager. The community became involved, organizing search efforts, and billboards were placed in high-traffic areas with Felicia's image and contact details. The search for Felicia Barnes continued for several months without any solid leads. In early February 2011, more than a month after she had vanished, Felicia's body was discovered in the Susquehanna River near a fishing pier in a rural area of northern Maryland, about 60 miles from Baltimore. Her body was found by a fisherman, and authorities confirmed it was her after conducting an autopsy. She had been dead for several weeks by the time her body was discovered. The discovery of Felicia's body set the stage for a homicide investigation. The cause of death was later determined to be strangulation. While the investigation initially involved several leads, it wasn't until later that police began focusing on her sister's boyfriend, Michael Johnson, as the prime suspect. Michael Johnson, who had been living with Felicia's sister at the time of her visit, was not initially considered a suspect. However, as the investigation unfolded, it was revealed that Johnson had a history of criminal behavior and had been the last person known to have seen Felicia alive. Additionally, surveillance footage showed him in the area around the time Felicia disappeared. Michael Johnson was arrested and charged with the murder of Felicia Barnes. Prosecutors argued that he had killed Felicia after an argument and had disposed of her body in the river. Johnson initially denied any involvement in her death and pled not guilty. During the trial, it was revealed that Johnson had a history of misconduct and was suspected of having inappropriate relationships with other young women. In March 2013, Johnson was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison. His conviction came after a lengthy trial in which prosecutors presented a variety of evidence, including witness testimony, DNA evidence, and the forensic findings that indicated Felicia's death was the result of foul play. The murder of Felicia Barnes had a lasting impact on her family, the Baltimore community, and even the nation. Her parents, particularly her mother, were vocal about the need for justice and the importance of finding answers. Her case also brought attention to the issue of missing persons, especially young people of color, and how these cases often don't receive the same level of attention from authorities or the media as cases involving white victims. The case also led to increased awareness of the issue of domestic violence, abuse, and the need for better protection of vulnerable individuals. Felicia's family became advocates for missing persons and worked to raise awareness about the dangers of situations involving manipulative and abusive individuals. Felicia Barnes' story has been remembered as one of loss and injustice, but also as a story of perseverance and the fight for justice. Her case highlighted the importance of both family and community in ensuring that missing person cases are taken seriously. Felicia's legacy is honored by her family's continued advocacy for victims of violence and abuse. This tragic event remains a poignant reminder of the horrors that many families face when they lose a loved one under such violent circumstances. Massachusetts. The Boston Marathon is one of the oldest and most prestigious annual marathon races in the world, traditionally held on Patriots' Day, a holiday in Massachusetts. The race attracts runners from around the globe, and thousands of spectators gather along the route to cheer them on. The race covers 26.2 miles, starting in Hopkinton, Massachusetts, and finishing near the Boston Public Library on Boylston Street in Boston. On the morning of April 15, 2013, the Boston Marathon began as scheduled, with more than 27,000 runners participating, including elite athletes, amateur runners, and charity participants. Spectators lined the streets, and the atmosphere was festive, with crowds cheering for the runners as they passed by. However, the festive and celebratory mood was shattered at around 2:49 p.m. when two explosions occurred near the finish line of the marathon. The bombs were detonated about 13 seconds apart in quick succession. The first explosion occurred at the intersection of Boylston Street and Berkeley Street, near the finish line. The second blast followed soon after, around 200 yards away, at the intersection of Boylston and Exeter Streets. The bombs were homemade pressure cooker devices packed with shrapnel, nails, and ball bearings designed to maximize injury. The devices were placed in black backpacks and left on the ground near the marathon's finish line, a place that was packed with spectators, many of whom were waiting for loved ones to finish the race. The explosions caused immediate panic. Shattered glass, debris, and smoke filled the air, and many spectators were knocked to the ground. The blast resulted in the deaths of 3 people and injuries to over 260 others, making it one of the deadliest attacks of domestic terrorism in recent U.S. history. The response to the bombings was immediate. Police, fire, and medical personnel rushed to the scene, and nearby hospitals were put on high alert to treat the injured. Many runners, despite being exhausted, immediately turned back to help victims. Medical personnel were already on site due to the marathon's medical infrastructure, so they quickly began treating the wounded. The FBI was quickly called to the scene, and the investigation began almost immediately. Authorities began reviewing footage from the race, including security cameras and videos taken by spectators. The investigation focused on identifying the perpetrators and understanding how they were able to carry out the attack. The bombing was carried out by 2 brothers, Tamerlan Zarnov and Zokhar Zarnev, who were of Chechen descent and had lived in the United States for several years. Tamerlan, the older brother, was reportedly motivated by extremist Islamic beliefs and had been investigated by the FBI prior to the bombing due to suspected ties to radical groups, though no charges were filed. The younger brother was a student at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth at the time. The Zarnev brothers had been planning the attack for months. They constructed the bombs using pressure cookers, filled them with explosive materials, and placed them at the finish line. After the bombing, they fled the scene, setting off a chain of events that would lead to a manhunt across Boston and surrounding areas. The bombings were followed by a massive manhunt. On the evening of April 18, 2013, Tamerlan and Zokhar engaged in a shootout with law enforcement officers in the Boston suburb of Watertown. Tamerlan was killed during the gunfight, while Zokhar managed to escape. The following day, the authorities conducted a lockdown of Boston and its surrounding areas, urging residents to stay indoors as they searched. The city's transit system was shut down and businesses were closed. After a tense day, Zokhar was discovered hiding in a boat in a backyard in Watertown, bleeding from gunshot wounds. He was captured alive and taken into custody. The attack left a lasting impact on Boston and the broader United States. The bombing sparked a nationwide conversation about terrorism, security, and the threat of radicalization. The people of Boston displayed remarkable resilience in the face of this tragedy, with the slogan "Boston Strong" becoming a symbol of the city's recovery and unity. The investigation revealed that the Zarnev brothers had been motivated by extremist beliefs, with the older brother reportedly influenced by radical ideologies he had encountered through online propaganda. He may have been inspired by groups like Al-Qaeda, though there was no direct evidence of their involvement. Zokhar Zarnev was eventually tried and convicted for his role in the bombing. In 2015, he was sentenced to death, although his sentence was later commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole after a lengthy legal battle. The case of the Boston Marathon bombings remains one of the most significant and tragic events in recent U.S. history. In the aftermath of the bombings, there were numerous tributes to the victims including memorial services, fundraisers, and events to support those affected. The bombing also led to changes in security at large public events and marathons, which increased surveillance and new protocols to prevent similar attacks in the future. The bombing had a profound effect on Boston, its residents, and the nation as a whole. The resilience of the people of Boston, particularly the first responders and citizens who helped the victims in the aftermath, became a source of inspiration. The annual Boston Marathon continues to be held, but with increased security measures, serving as a reminder of both tragedy and the strength of the city and its people. Michigan. The Kalamazoo Uber driver shootings was a series of fatal shootings that took place on the evening of February 20th, 2016 in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Carried out by Jason Brian Dalton, a 45-year-old former Uber driver. The shootings shocked the local community and the nation as they unfolded over several hours in a seemingly random and unprovoked manner. Jason Dalton was a 45-year-old man who had been working as an Uber driver for several months leading up to the events of February 20th, 2016. He had no known history of violence or criminal behavior before the shootings. Dalton's life appeared ordinary, but on the night of the killings, his actions took a horrific turn. Dalton had been working as an Uber driver on the evening of February 20th, transporting passengers in the Kalamazoo area. He had picked up a passenger earlier in the evening, and during this ride he seemed perfectly normal. However, by the time he dropped off the passenger, Dalton had begun his violent spree, and the night would devolve into chaos. The first shooting occurred at approximately 6 p.m. at the Tin Shop Apartments on the southwest side of Kalamazoo. A woman named Teresa and her 17-year-old daughter, who were sitting in a car, were shot. The mother survived, but the daughter, who had been sitting in the passenger seat, was killed. At this time, Jason Dalton was not yet known to be the shooter, and no immediate connection was made to his role as an Uber driver. Dalton continued his rampage after the first shooting. A few hours later, at about 10 p.m., he opened fire at a different location, the Meadows Townhomes. This is where the majority of the victims were shot. In this incident, a man named Richard and his son Tyler were shot at the scene. Tyler survived but was seriously injured. Tragically, Richard did not survive. Dalton then moved on to another nearby area, continuing the violence without any apparent motive. Dalton's final and deadliest shooting occurred when he shot and killed 4 people who were sitting in a car outside a local restaurant. The victims were shot at close range while sitting in their vehicle. It was during this time that authorities began to realize that these shootings were all connected, as they had been happening in a similar manner in different parts of the city. At some point during the night, Dalton picked up another Uber passenger. Little did the passenger know they were riding with a killer. That ride ended when the passenger reached their destination and Dalton was still on the loose, but police were beginning to close in on him. Dalton was arrested on February 21st, 2016, after a series of tips led local law enforcement to identify him as the prime suspect. He was found sitting in his car at a Kalamazoo shopping center, where he was taken into custody without incident. During the investigation, it was revealed that Dalton had no known history of mental illness or criminal behavior. He was married with children, and the neighbors described him as a quiet, reserved man. Dalton was reportedly active in his community, and his behavior before the killings seemed to be normal. However, investigators discovered that he may have been struggling with personal issues in the weeks leading up to the shootings, including problems with his marriage and financial difficulties. Dalton later told authorities that he felt compelled to commit the shootings, but he had no clear motive. He explained that he had been having bad thoughts and felt as though he was being controlled by an external force, though he did not explicitly state that he had had a specific target or reason for the attacks. Jason Dalton was charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. In January 2019, he pled guilty to all charges, including 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. As part of a plea agreement, he avoided the death penalty, but he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The shooting spree in Kalamazoo raised significant questions about the safety of ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft. While Uber had performed background checks on Dalton before hiring him, there were concerns about whether these checks were thorough enough to prevent individuals with potential violent tendencies from driving for the company. The Kalamazoo Uber driver shootings deeply impacted the Kalamazoo community and left the families of the victims grappling with the loss of their loved ones. It also sparked a broader conversation about mental health, gun control, and the regulation of ride-sharing companies. In the aftermath of the shooting, Uber and other ride-sharing companies began to review and refine their screening and safety procedures. Public awareness about the potential dangers associated with ride-sharing services increased, and many questioned whether the systems in place were sufficient to prevent similar tragedies from occurring again. The Kalamazoo shootings also left a lasting emotional impact on the survivors, some of whom continue to cope with the trauma of the event. The tragedy served as a reminder of the unpredictable nature of violence and the importance of both mental health support and preventative measures in society. Minnesota. Jacob Wetterling was born on February 17, 1978, to parents Jerry and Patty Wetterling. He had a younger brother, Trevor, and a younger sister, Amy. The Wetterling family lived in St. Joseph, a small town in central Minnesota. Jacob was known for being a kind, intelligent, and curious young boy who loved sports and had a passion for his family. On the night of his abduction, Jacob had been out with his brother Trevor and a friend Aaron for an evening bike ride. The 3 of them had been on a trip to a nearby store to buy candy, and they were heading home when the events that would change their lives forever unfolded. At approximately 9 p.m. on October 22, 1989, Jacob, his brother Trevor, and their friend Aaron were riding their bikes home from the convenience store. They were about a mile from their house on a rural road not far from where the Wetterling family lived. As they neared the end of a long dirt road, a man appeared from behind a set of trees. The man, described as being in his mid-20s to early 30s, was wearing a mask and holding a gun. He ordered the boys to stop, in a chilling moment, instructed them to lie down on the ground. The man told the boys to keep their heads down, warning them that if they looked up, they would be shot. Trevor, who was younger and frightened, later said that the man told them he was a cop. The man then grabbed Jacob, telling him to walk with him. Jacob tried to resist, but the man told him not to make any noise. Jacob's last words were, "I'll be back, I promise." He was forced into the woods, disappearing into the night. Trevor and Aaron were left behind, terrified and alone. They later ran to a nearby home to seek help. When authorities were alerted, a massive search effort began immediately. The Wetterling family, along with the local community, was devastated by Jacob's disappearance. A massive search was launched, involving law enforcement officers from across the state, local volunteers, and the FBI. The search continued for days, weeks, and even months, with no sign of Jacob. The case gained national attention, and in the wake of his disappearance, several theories about what had happened to Jacob began to emerge. One of the most notable aspects of the investigation was the investigation of a man who had been seen in the area around the time of Jacob's abduction. Over the years, there were numerous false leads, and the case began to go cold. In 1990, just a few months after Jacob was abducted, another abduction occurred in nearby Sauk Rapids, Minnesota. That case, however, was solved quickly and the suspect was arrested. This man was eventually ruled out as a suspect in Jacob's case, but it added to the sense of unease and fear in the community. The FBI took a central role in the investigation. Over the years, agents followed leads, spoke with hundreds of potential suspects, and conducted interviews. However, the case remained unsolved. In the years following the abduction, the Wetterling family endured heartbreak, uncertainty, and hope that someday their son would be found. As the years passed, Jacob's abduction remained a source of emotional pain for the Wetterling family and the broader community. The case became a symbol of missing children, and in 1994, the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offender Registration Act was passed. This law created a national database for offenders and required law enforcement to track their movements. This law was named after Jacob to honor him and ensure that no other family would go through the same tragedy. After more than 26 years, the mystery of Jacob's disappearance was finally solved. In 2016, a man named Danny Heinrich, who had been a suspect in the case for years, was arrested for the abduction and murder of Jacob Wetterling. Heinrich, who had been previously interviewed by investigators, had been connected to the case through DNA evidence. Heinrich had been living in Minnesota under a different name, and for years he had denied any involvement in the abduction. However, a breakthrough came when investigators connected Heinrich to another crime that had occurred in the area around the same time as Jacob's abduction. On September 6, 2016, Heinrich confessed to abducting and killing Jacob. He led investigators to a site where Jacob's remains were found, buried in a field about 20 miles from the Wetterling's family home. Heinrich explained that he had abducted Jacob, taken him to a secluded area, and assaulted him before killing him. The motive for the crime was never fully explained, and it remains one of the most chilling aspects of the case. The discovery of Jacob's remains brought a sense of closure to the Wetterling family, but it also left them devastated by the confirmation of their worst fear. Patty and Jerry Wetterling were determined to keep their son's memory alive and honor his legacy. They continued to advocate for the safety of children and for changes in the legal system to protect families from the horrors of abduction and violence. In 2017, the Wetterling family, along with advocates for missing children, pushed for changes in how the justice system handled cases of abduction and child abuse. The case brought greater awareness to the need for stronger laws protecting children and led to significant reforms in how such crimes are handled by authorities. Jacob Wetterling's story, while tragic, ultimately helped to shape the legal landscape surrounding child abductions and the safety of children across the United States. His memory continues to inspire both grief and hope, and his case stands as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and advocacy for the protection of children everywhere. Mississippi. Kingston Frazier was a 6-year-old boy from Jackson, Mississippi. His mother, Latasha Frazier, had gone through a tough time, and on the morning of May 18, 2017, she left her son in the back of the car while she ran into a local store. This seemingly routine moment quickly turned into a nightmare when the car was stolen, with Kingston inside. The incident occurred in broad daylight. Latasha had parked her car outside a Kroger store on Northside Drive in Jackson, Mississippi, while she went inside to buy some groceries. Kingston was asleep in the back seat of the car. However, when Latasha returned to her car around 1 p.m., she was horrified to discover that it had been stolen, with her son inside. Latasha immediately called the police, and the authorities began a search for the car and her son. The vehicle was a gray 2000 Toyota Avalon, and authorities worked quickly trying to gather any surveillance footage from nearby businesses and gathering information from the community. As the search intensified, the police identified 2 suspects in the theft of the car: 18-year-old Byron McBride and 17-year-old Cedric Hester. McBride was the one who had stolen the car. Later police reports confirmed that McBride had a history of thefts and other criminal activities, and that he was reportedly attempting to flee the scene with Kingston still inside. Later, the investigators determined that McBride and Hester had a plan to use the car for a robbery. McBride had taken Kingston with him, not intending to harm the child, but in a misguided attempt to get away from police. The kidnapping quickly escalated into a tragedy. After McBride and Hester were arrested, authorities learned that the child was tragically shot and left in the woods. Kingston was found hours later on the evening of May 18, 2017, near a wooded area in Jackson. He had been shot in the back of the head, and his body was left discarded in a makeshift grave. His life had been taken far too soon. Byron McBride was arrested and charged with capital murder, kidnapping, and other related charges. The case sent shockwaves through the community as the brutal and senseless killing of a young child left many people devastated. McBride, who was 18 at the time of the crime, was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Cedric Hester, the accomplice, faced charges related to the kidnapping and conspiracy, but he was not directly involved in the murder itself. Kingston Frazier's death stirred a wave of public outcry in Jackson and beyond. The community, along with people across the country, mourned the loss of a young life. Kingston had his whole future ahead of him, but it was stolen in an instant by the reckless actions of the suspects. Kingston's family was devastated by the loss, and his mother, Latasha Frazier, spoke publicly about her grief and the tragedy of losing her son in such a senseless manner. The case highlighted the dangers of car theft and the vulnerability of children in such situations. It also brought attention to the problem of violent crime in Jackson, a city that had faced challenges with increasing crime rates in recent years. the Kingston Fraser case remains one of the most heart-wrenching events in Jackson's recent history. It serves as a reminder of how quickly a life can be taken and how important it is to protect our children from harm. Kingston's story touched many people's hearts, and his death led to calls for increased safety measures, more attention to youth crime, and stronger consequences for those involved in violent acts. His family's pain and the sadness of the community still linger, and Kingston Fraser will forever be remembered as a young boy whose life was taken too soon. Missouri. Molly Watson, a 35-year-old woman from Huntsville, Missouri, was tragically murdered on April 27, 2018, just 2 days before her planned wedding to James Addy. Her body was discovered on a rural road near Middle Grove in Monroe County, Missouri, laying outside her car with a gunshot wound to the back of her head. James Addy, a 51-year-old corrections officer at the Moberly Correctional Center, had been secretly involved with Watson for approximately 7 years. Despite being married to his wife of 22 years, Melanie Addy, he had led a double life, falsely telling Watson that his wife had died in a car accident. Watson, deeply in love with Addy, was unaware of his deception. The night Watson's body was found, a passerby noticed headlights near a creek bed and upon investigation discovered the body. Tire tracks near the scene were consistent with Addy's vehicle. When authorities went to inform Addy of Watson's death, they were greeted by his wife, revealing his secret affair. In April 2021, after a 4-day trial, a Cole County jury convicted Addy of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for the armed criminal action charge. Molly Watson is remembered as a devoted mother and a woman who cherished her family. Her tragic death highlighted the dangers of domestic deception and the importance of trust in relationships. Thank you for watching Part 2, The 50 States of True Crime, Series 2. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll be notified every time we upload a new video. Hit the like button and leave us a comment down below. And until next time, stay curious. Montana. On June 25, 1983, 4-year-old Nylene K. Marshall vanished without a trace in the Elkhorn Mountains near Helena, Montana. She had been on a family picnic at Bear Creek in the Helena National Forest, surrounded by friends, relatives, and other children. While the adults chatted nearby, the children played by the creek. At some point, Nylene wandered slightly away from the group with a few of the other kids, but when the others returned, Nylene didn't. Her disappearance triggered an enormous search. Hundreds of volunteers scoured the area. Bloodhounds, helicopters, and search teams combed the rugged forest terrain, but not a single trace was found. No clothing, no footprints, nothing. For a while, people wondered, did she fall? Was it an animal attack? Or had she simply gotten lost in the wilderness? But then, suspicions shifted. Some witnesses reported seeing a man in a jogging suit nearby, behaving strangely. One child said they saw Nylene speaking to a man shortly before she vanished. That's when the theory of abduction took hold. 2 years later, the case took an even darker turn. In 1985 and 1986, someone began making phone calls to law enforcement and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. He claimed he had Nylene. He said he had taken her because he loved her and was raising her as his own daughter. Then came the letters. Typed, mailed from Madison, Wisconsin, and full of deeply unsettling details. Details that had never been made public. The man claimed he homeschooled her, that they traveled often to Canada, to Mexico, across the United States, that she was healthy, cared for, and called by her middle name, Kay. He said he never took her to doctors or schools to avoid detection. He expressed remorse, but claimed he couldn't return her without facing arrest. The authorities believed the letters were authentic. They contained information that only someone involved in the disappearance could have known. But the man was never identified. In 1990, the case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, drawing national attention. Not long after the episode aired, a girl in a New Orleans hospital claimed to be Nylene. Authorities investigated, but it was another dead end. Years passed. Her mother, Nancy Marshall, tragically lost her life in the 1990s while working as a missionary nurse in Mexico. Her father, Kim, never stopped hoping for answers. To this day, Nylene K. Marshall remains missing. Her case is still open. No one knows who took her. No one knows what really happened in those quiet Montana woods. And no one knows if she's still out there somewhere. Nebraska. On November 15, 2017, 24-year-old Sydney Loof vanished without a trace. A bright, kind-hearted young woman from Lincoln, Nebraska, Sydney worked at the local Menards store and was known for her warm smile and love of animals. That evening, she had a second date planned with someone she met on Tinder. The person she was meeting was 23-year-old Bailey Boswell. Their first date had gone well enough that Sydney was excited for another. She even posted a Snapchat selfie that night, captioned, "Ready for my date." It would be the last time anyone heard from her. When Sydney failed to show up for work the next day, her family grew concerned. Days turned into nights. A frantic search began. Friends, family, and volunteers scoured the area while investigators tried to retrace her last known steps. As the investigators dug deeper, they discovered Bailey hadn't been alone. She was living with a 51-year-old man named Aubrey Trail, her boyfriend and partner in what would soon be revealed as a horrifying scheme. The two fled Nebraska shortly after Sydney disappeared. Before vanishing, Bailey and Aubrey were caught on camera buying tools, drop cloths, bleach, and hacksaws. A chilling list of supplies. Authorities tracked their movements through surveillance and digital forensics, and after a nationwide manhunt, they were arrested in Missouri. On December 4th, 2017, nearly 3 weeks after she vanished, Sydney's dismembered remains were found in garbage bags scattered across a remote field. The cause of death? Homicidal violence. Aubrey Trail confessed during his trial. He claimed Sydney died accidentally during a consensual encounter involving asphyxiation, but the evidence told another story. Prosecutors revealed Trail and Boswell had lured Sydney through a fake online persona. They were obsessed with control and power. and investigators believed they planned the murder. During his 2019 trial, Trail caused a scene, yelling in court and even slashing his own neck with a razor blade. He survived, and later he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Bailey Boswell, who claimed she feared Trail and was under his influence, was also convicted and became the first woman in Nebraska to face a death sentence in over a century. Sidney Loof's family has since turned their grief into action, raising awareness about online safety and the hidden dangers of digital dating. Her story is a tragic reminder that behind the screen, not everyone is who they claim to be. Nevada. Catherine Ann Howard, 35 years old, was last seen alive leaving her apartment in northeast Reno. She was intelligent, hardworking, and well-liked by her colleagues. But in the early morning hours of that spring day, something went terribly wrong. She never made it to work. Hours passed, then days. When Catherine didn't show up or call in, her employer grew concerned. Her friends knew this wasn't like her. She was dependable and reliable. They soon contacted the police. Reno police arrived at Catherine's home and found no signs of forced entry, but inside they noticed something chilling. Her purse was there, so were her keys. The scene looked almost paused, as if she had stepped out for just a moment, but she hadn't returned. 3 days later, on March 21st, hikers near a remote stretch of the desert east of Reno spotted something unusual, a partially buried body. It was Catherine. She had been beaten, bound, and strangled to death. Investigators later confirmed she had been assaulted. Her body was dumped off a dirt road and hastily covered. The brutality of the crime shook the city, but the case would go cold. For nearly 2 decades, no arrest, no answers. In 2002, Reno detectives reopened the cold case as part of a push to retest DNA evidence. Technology had evolved, and now there was a viable sample from the crime scene. The DNA matched Thomas Edward Creech, an inmate on death row in Idaho. Creech was already one of Idaho's most notorious killers, convicted of multiple murders across several states, but he had never been linked to Catherine until the DNA hit. In 2021, Washoe County prosecutors filed murder charges against him. He was extradited to Nevada to face trial nearly 40 years after Catherine was taken from her family. Creech pled guilty in exchange for a life sentence in Nevada. His admission finally brought a measure of closure, though not peace, to a family who had waited decades for justice. Catherine Ann Howard was not forgotten. It took time, it took technology, but her voice was heard. New Hampshire. A promising student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Maura emailed professors saying there'd been a death in the family. That wasn't true. No one in her family had died. She packed her car, withdrew $280 from an ATM, bought alcohol, and drove north. Her destination? Unknown. Her reasons? Still unclear. Around 7:27 p.m., a resident heard a loud thump. Maura's black sedan had crashed into a snowbank. A local bus driver stopped to help. She said she had already called for roadside assistance, but she hadn't. By the time the police arrived, just after 7:45 p.m., Maura was gone. No footprints led away from the car, no sign of a struggle, just a bottle of wine on the back seat and a rag stuffed into the tailpipe. In the hours before her disappearance, Maura had searched for lodging in Vermont and New Hampshire. She didn't tell friends where she was going. She hadn't packed hiking gear or cold weather clothing. Maura's father, Fred Murray, believes she was met with foul play. Others suspect she walked into the woods distraught and succumbed to the elements. But no trace of her, no clothing, phone, or body has ever been found. Despite extensive searches, interviews, and renewed public interest, Maura's case remains one of the most haunting cold cases. She was 21 years old with her whole life ahead of her, and then just gone. What really happened to Maura Murray? Was she running from something or towards something? And why has no one seen her since? New Jersey. It was just after 7 p.m. on February 1st, 2023, when gunshots echoed through the quiet Camelot at Lemur apartment complex. Councilwoman Eunice Dwumfor, only 30 years old, had just pulled into her driveway. Moments later, she was ambushed in her white Nissan SUV. Multiple shots were fired. Her vehicle rolled down a small hill and crashed into parked cars. Eunice was a mother, a pastor, and a newly elected Republican councilwoman, known for her deep faith and infectious positivity. She had just begun her term in office. Police found her dead at the scene, shot multiple times. No signs of robbery, no known enemies, and no immediate suspects. Her death shocked the community, a young leader gunned down without warning. Friends described her as kind and devoted. Her church, Champions Royal Assembly, mourned a loss they couldn't explain. For months, there were no arrests. Rumors swirled. Was it political, personal, religious? Authorities remained tight-lipped. Then, in May 2023, a breakthrough. Rashid Ali Bynum, a 28-year-old man from Virginia with ties to the same church as Eunice, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Investigators traced his cell phone and vehicle from Virginia to New Jersey that day. Surveillance video, phone records, a contact saved in her phone, the pieces all came together. But the questions still remain. What was the motive? Prosecutors haven't revealed anything. Her family and the community wait. Eunice Dwumfor's life was full of promise. Her story now a tragic reminder of how quickly light can be taken by darkness. New Mexico, February 2nd, 2009, on the desolate outskirts of Albuquerque, New Mexico, a woman walking her dog stumbles upon something that would ignite one of the city's most haunting mysteries. She finds a human bone. At first, police assume it's an isolated case, but soon more remains surface. When the digging is done, authorities have uncovered the skeletal remains of 11 women and one unborn child, all buried in shallow graves, all murdered, and all dumped in a remote stretch of land known as the West Mesa. The victims range in age from 15 to 32. Most are Hispanic. All of them had been reported missing between 2003 and 2005. The site where the remains were found was once a quiet construction zone, part of a housing development that stalled with the 2008 financial crash. Before then, it had been mostly untouched desert. This gave the killer the perfect cover. For years, Families of the missing had begged police to investigate. Many of the women had vanished under eerily similar circumstances, but their lifestyles led some investigators to dismiss the disappearances. Now faced with the undeniable evidence of a serial killer, detective launched what would become one of the largest investigations in New Mexico history. Thousands of tips poured in, leads spanned states, suspects emerged and disappeared. One suspect, Lorenzo Montoya, lived just miles from the burial site. He had a history of violence against women and a chilling incident in 2006. Montoya strangled an adult worker in his trailer, then was shot dead by her pimp. After his death, the killings appeared to stop. But without forensic evidence tying him to the West Mesa victims, the case remained open. Investigators also examined satellite images, hoping to pinpoint where the graves were dug. This method confirmed that the burials happened during a tight window between 2003 and 2005. Despite rewards and years of work, the case remains unsolved. No one has been charged. For Albuquerque, the West Mesa murders are a dark reminder of the vulnerable being forgotten until it's too late. 12 souls buried in silence, a killer still unaccounted for, and a city still searching for justice. Someone out there knows the truth. New York. It was 3:15 a.m. on March 13, 1964, when 28-year-old Catherine Kitty Genovese parked her red Fiat just 100 feet from her apartment building in Kew Gardens, Queens. She had just finished her shift managing a local bar and was headed home, but she never made it inside. As she walked towards her apartment, a man stepped out of the shadows. His name was Winston Mosley, a 29-year-old married man and father of two. With no connection to Kitty, he had simply decided that night to kill a woman. Any woman. Mosley approached from behind and stabbed her twice in the back. Kitty screamed, "Oh my God, he stabbed me, help me." A light flickered on in a nearby apartment. A man shouted, "Leave that girl alone." Mosley ran, but only briefly. After waiting in his car for 10 minutes and seeing no police, no one coming to Kitty's aid, he returned. He found her crawling towards the back of her building, trying to reach a locked door. Bleeding and disoriented, she was still alive. Mosley stabbed her again, then assaulted her. Then he stabbed her one final time, killing her. It wasn't until 3:50 a.m. that someone finally called the police. Kitty was taken away by ambulance, but she was already gone. At first, the murder seemed just another tragic act of urban violence, but 2 weeks later, an article in the New York Times changed everything. The headline read, "37 who saw murder didn't call the police." The public was horrified. According to the story, dozens of people had heard Kitty's screams, saw some part of the attack, but no one intervened. No one helped. No one even picked up the phone. The nation asked, how could this happen? This chilling incident led psychologists Bob Latane and John Darley to coin the term bystander effect, the phenomenon where the presence of others discourages individuals from helping in an emergency. The Kitty Genovese case became a cornerstone of modern social psychology. Winston Mosley was caught just 6 days later after being arrested for a separate burglary. He confessed not only to Kitty's murder, but to 2 other killings and numerous assaults. He was sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison. He died in 2016 after more than 50 years behind bars. In the end, Kitty Genovese became more than a victim. Her name became a symbol, a painful lesson about silence, apathy, and the cost of inaction. Her story is a reminder, not acting is a choice, and sometimes that choice has deadly consequences. North Carolina. It was February 17, 1970, around 3:45 a.m., when military police at Fort Bragg received a frantic call from Army Surgeon Captain Jeffrey McDonald. He reported a stabbing at his home on 544 Castle Drive. When they arrived, they found a horrifying scene. Inside the McDonald home, they discovered the brutally beaten and stabbed bodies of his pregnant wife Colette and their two daughters, 5-year-old Kimberly and 2-year-old Kristen. Jeffrey McDonald himself had sustained relatively minor injuries, a puncture wound to the chest, and some bruises. McDonald told investigators that intruders had broken in, 3 men and a blonde woman in a floppy hat. He said they chanted, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs," as they attacked the family. A claim chillingly reminiscent of the recent Manson family murders in California. McDonald claimed that he was asleep on the couch and awoke to Colette's screams. He described a chaotic struggle, 3 men attacking him with an ice pick and club, while the woman stood by chanting. He said he lost consciousness and awoke to find his wife and daughters dead. The brutality was staggering. Colette had been bludgeoned and stabbed at least 21 times with an ice pick and 16 times with a knife. Kimberly had been clubbed in the head and stabbed, while little Kristen was stabbed over 30 times. But soon, Army Criminal Investigation Division began to doubt McDonald's story. There were no signs of forced entry, no muddy footprints, no evidence of a struggle consistent with his account, and his injuries were deemed superficial, more self-inflicted than defensive. Blood evidence painted a different story. Each family member had a different blood type, and their patterns throughout the house told investigators who was attacked and where. The findings suggested McDonald had moved around freely during or after the murders. Despite the growing suspicions, a military hearing in late 1970 dismissed the charges against him, citing insufficient evidence. McDonald was honorably discharged and moved to California, resuming his career as a doctor. But Colette's stepfather, Alfred Kassab, was not convinced. He had once believed in McDonald's innocence, but after reviewing the case files and inconsistencies, he pushed for justice. For nearly a decade, he lobbied prosecutors to take another look. In 1975, a federal grand jury was convened. 4 years later, in 1979, Jeffrey McDonald was indicted for the murders of his wife and daughters. The trial began in 1979. The prosecution laid out forensic evidence, inconsistencies in McDonald's statements, and behavioral red flags. The defense argued that he was a victim of a botched investigation and pointed to a woman named Helena Stokely, who had once confessed to being in the house that night. Stokely, a known drug user, had given conflicting statements over the years. Sometimes she claimed involvement, sometimes she denied it. But the jury remained unconvinced by her testimony. On August 29, 1979, Jeffrey McDonald was found guilty of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms. Over the years, McDonald has maintained his innocence, filing numerous appeals. In 2012, the case was revisited with new DNA evidence, but none of it exonerated him. In 2021, the Fourth Circuit Court upheld his conviction again. Today, Jeffrey McDonald remains incarcerated. Over 5 decades have passed since that brutal night in 1970. The questions may linger, but the justice system has rendered its verdict. North Dakota. Monday morning, April 1st, 2019. Employees began arriving at RJR Maintenance and Management in Mandan, North Dakota, a quiet property management company just outside Bismarck. But something was off. The front door was unlocked, unusual for that hour. Inside, a horrific scene was discovered. 4 people, Robert Fackler, co-owner of the company, and 3 employees, Adam Fuhrer, Lois Cobb, and William Cobb, were found brutally murdered. Each victim had suffered both gunshot and stab wounds. Some had signs of blunt force trauma. The scene was chaotic. Signs of struggle, blood spatter, and disarray throughout the office. The Mandan police launched an immediate investigation. The community was in shock. Quadruple homicides are rare anywhere. In North Dakota, they're almost unheard of. Surveillance footage from the early morning hours showed a suspect entering the building shortly before 7 a.m., dressed in all black, with his face mostly concealed. The figure moved with purpose. He appeared to know the layout. Detectives combed through local tips, background checks, and camera footage, and one name started to surface: Chad Isaac. A chiropractor from Washburn, about 35 miles north of Mandan, Isaac had rented a lot from RJR. There had been no formal disputes, but authorities discovered that Isaac had visited the RJR office multiple times. A search warrant was issued. When police searched Isaac's home, vehicle, and office, what they found was chilling. Dark clothing matching the footage, knives, a mask, traces of blood and DNA evidence that would later link him to the crime scene, gunshot residue on his hands, and inside his washing machine, items being bleached. Though Isaac had no criminal history and no clear motive, the physical evidence was mounting. He was arrested 4 days after the murder and charged with 4 counts of murder, burglary, concealment of a body, and unauthorized use of a vehicle. Throughout the investigation and trial, Isaac maintained his innocence. The motive, still unclear. Prosecutors suggested a grudge against RJR, possibly over eviction threats or minor disputes, but no concrete motive was ever fully established. In August 2021, Chad Isaac was found guilty on all counts. During sentencing, family members of the victims delivered emotional statements. Isaac received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. To this day, the reason behind the brutality remains largely speculative. No confession, no clear motive, just 4 lives lost in a calculated, chilling act of violence that left a community searching for answers. RJR Maintenance and Management continues to operate, but the memory of that day will never leave the building or the town of Mandan. Ohio. In the early hours of April 11, 1993, Lucasville Correctional Facility, located in southern Ohio, was about to become the epicenter of one of the longest and deadliest prison riots in U.S. history. But to understand what happened that day, we need to look back at what led to it. Lucasville was overcrowded, like most prisons during the 80s and 90s. Tensions had been brewing for months. Inmates were dealing with subpar conditions, poor medical care, overcrowded cells, and constant racial tensions between rival prison factions. But it wasn't just the conditions. The facility was divided into two main factions, the blacks and the whites, who had a fragile truce. On top of this, a new drug policy was implemented, and the prison staff growing indifference to inmate demands was creating a powder keg ready to explode. At 1 a.m. on that fateful Sunday, the fuse was lit. It began as a small confrontation in the prison yard, which quickly escalated. Inmates seized control of several parts of the facility, taking hostages, guards, and fellow inmates alike. As the inmates flooded the yard and stormed key locations, they demanded better conditions, especially around medical care and the implementation of an inmate grievance system. But the demands were not enough to prevent the riot from spiraling into something much more sinister. The standoff was intense. Among the hostages were 14 prison guards and several other prisoners who had been caught in the crossfire. The inmates, divided between different groups, now had a fragile power structure, but what would follow would become even darker. On the second day, the violence escalated. The inmates began killing those they perceived as threats. Two guards, Officer Robert Vallandingham and Officer William Bill Kegley, were brutally murdered. Robert was killed early in the riot, stabbed in the neck with a makeshift weapon, while William met a horrific fate after being taken hostage. His death would later send shockwaves through the prison system. While the violence escalated, so did the calls for negotiations. Inmate leaders were using the hostages as leverage to demand more food, better medical care, and an end to the corrupt prison administration. The negotiators, state officials, were under extreme pressure. Despite the tense standoff, the rioting factions, which included black Muslim groups, white supremacists, and the mainstream inmates, all needed to come together for the negotiation to work. While the authorities tried to establish a calm, the inmates began implementing their own rules. Some of them took it upon themselves to execute suspected informants, ensuring their own authority in the chaos. After 11 long days, with 9 deaths, including guards and inmates, the riot came to an end when the Ohio National Guard was called in. By that time, the facility was a war zone. The prisoners were finally subdued, but the consequences of the riot would resonate for years. The state of Ohio faced criticism from both inside and outside the prison. The failure to prevent the riot was a major blow to the prison system. The following years saw a series of trials. Inmates involved in the murders were sentenced to death, including James Ware, who would later become one of the most infamous figures from the riot. As for the guards, many were left emotionally scarred by the violence they had witnessed. The Lucasville riot remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of overcrowded and poorly managed prison systems. It also highlights the fragility of control in environments where desperation and frustration reach a boiling point. And while the riot ended with the deaths of 10 men, it also sparked reform discussions about prison conditions, the treatment of inmates, and the role of authority in maintaining peace. But for those who lived through it, Lucasville is a scar that will never fade. Pennsylvania. August 28, 2003, in Erie, Pennsylvania. A call comes in to Mamma Mia's Pizzeria. The order: 2 small pizzas to a remote location near a TV tower on the outskirts of town. Brian Wells, a 46-year-old delivery man, takes the call. He drives to the strange location and vanishes. When he reappears, it's with a collar, an actual bomb, locked around his neck. A crude shotgun disguised as a cane in his hand, and a set of bizarre instructions. 2:30 p.m., Wells walks into a PNC bank in Erie and hands the teller a note, demanding $250,000. The teller gives him what they can, $8,702. Minutes later, he's apprehended by police in a nearby parking lot. Sitting cross-legged on the pavement, he tells the officers about the bomb, about the notes, and about the threats. At 3:18 p.m., before the bomb squad can arrive, the device detonates. Brian Wells was killed instantly. The investigation reveals a story stranger than fiction. A twisted plot involving a scavenger hunt, a murder-for-hire scheme, and a group of unlikely co-conspirators. At the center, Marjorie Armstrong, diagnosed with multiple mental disorders. She masterminded the robbery to finance a hit on her own father so she could inherit his fortune. Kenneth Barnes, her accomplice, a crack dealer, enlisted to carry out the murder. He agreed in exchange for a cut of the bank money. Then there was William Rothstein, a former boyfriend of Marjorie's. His home, the same location where Wells received the collar bomb. Floyd Stockton, another man living with Rothstein at the time, helps put the bomb on Wells. He later gets immunity for testifying. Initially, Wells appeared to be a victim, but the deeper the investigators dug, the murkier things got. Evidence showed he may have known about the plot. He believed the bomb was fake, but it wasn't. In 2007, Armstrong and Barnes were charged. Barnes pled guilty and cooperated. Armstrong was sentenced to life in prison. She died in custody in 2017. The case became the subject of the 2018 Netflix docuseries Evil Genius, uncovering the chilling layers behind what may be the most bizarre bank heist in American history. A man manipulated a collar bomb, a deadly scavenger hunt, and a plan so bizarre, even Hollywood couldn't make it up. Rhode Island. Cam Lyman was known in the elite world of dog breeding, wealthy, private, and respected for breeding champion Clumber Spaniels. Cam was eccentric, intensively private, and by the early 1990s, largely reclusive. Lyman lived in a sprawling estate in Hopkinton, Rhode Island, but what was once a place of prestige would become the center of a chilling mystery. In 1993, friends began to grow concerned. Cam had seemingly vanished. The caretaker, George O'Neill, claimed Lyman had simply gone west to California. But no one had seen or heard from Cam in months. Even the dogs had been left behind. When police were finally brought in, inconsistencies piled up. Mail was uncollected. Lyman's bank accounts sat untouched. And O'Neill? He had begun wearing Lyman's clothes, driving Lyman's car, and managing finances as if nothing was wrong. Yet despite the red flags, the investigation stalled. For years, Cam Lyman remained a missing person. Then in 1997, 4 years later, everything changed. During renovations on Lyman's property, a septic tank was opened. Inside were the skeletal remains of Cam Lyman, wrapped in plastic, hidden from the world for years. The medical examiner ruled it a homicide. Suspicion immediately turned to George O'Neill, but despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, he was never charged with murder. He claimed he had nothing to do with the death, and without definitive proof, the case went cold. Cam Lyman's murder remains unsolved to this day. No justice, no answers, just the lingering mystery of a wealthy recluse whose death was buried, literally, and whose story still haunts Rhode Island's quiet corners. South Carolina. The Murdaugh name has been long synonymous with power and privilege in South Carolina's Low Country. For nearly a century, the Murdaugh family controlled the local legal system, with 3 generations of lawyers holding the position of solicitor, the top prosecutor for the area. But beneath this legacy of influence, dark secrets festered. In June of 2021, a shocking event would unravel the Murdaugh dynasty, a tragic murder that would captivate the nation. The story begins at the family estate, Moselle, a sprawling property where Alex Murdaugh, a prominent lawyer, lived with his wife Maggie and their 2 sons, Paul and Buster. On the evening of June 7, 2021, Alex Murdaugh, a 53-year-old attorney, arrived at the family's hunting lodge. Inside, he found the bodies of his wife Maggie and their youngest son Paul. Both had been shot multiple times. Maggie Murdaugh had been shot with an assault rifle, and Paul had been shot with a shotgun. Their bodies were discovered near the dog kennels on the property. Alex, devastated and hysterical, called 911, claiming that he had just discovered their bodies. He told dispatch that he had gone to visit his sick father and mother, but when he returned, he found his family dead. A 911 call was one of the first pieces of evidence that law enforcement would scrutinize. The details seemed suspicious. Why hadn't Alex noticed anything out of place when he first arrived at the house? Why was he so calm on the phone? Soon after the bodies were discovered, the investigation into the murders began. But what was initially a tragic double homicide quickly turned into a complex web of lies, deceit, and hidden family secrets. At first, Alex Murdaugh was considered a grieving husband and father. However, law enforcement began to question the circumstances surrounding the deaths. Witnesses came forward saying Alex's behavior was odd. Investigators discovered that he had been at the crime scene around the time of the murders, but hadn't mentioned it initially. One of the reasons why investigators began to turn their focus on Alex was because of Paul Murdaugh's ongoing legal issues. Just months earlier, Paul had been involved in a boating accident that led to the death of 19-year-old Mallory Beach. Paul had been facing charges for boating under the influence, and his family's legal team was embroiled in a battle to get him off the hook. Paul's involvement in the boating accident had caused public outrage, and many speculated that the Murdaugh family's legal influence would ensure Paul avoided serious consequences. The anger from the Beach family and the public, combined with the mystery of his sudden death, made Paul a possible target. But there was more to Alex Murdaugh than met the eye. As the investigation continued, it was revealed that Alex was facing severe financial problems. He had been embezzling millions of dollars from his law firm and clients, using the funds to fuel his lavish lifestyle and cover up his debts. His financial ruin was a ticking time bomb. In addition to his legal and financial troubles, Alex had been involved in a number of suspicious incidents. There was the mysterious death of his housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, in 2018. She had died after allegedly tripping and falling at the Murdaugh estate, but questions were raised about whether her death had been accidental. Alex had also collected a large insurance payout after her death. Everyone in the community knew the Murdaughs, but no one really knew what was going on behind closed doors. Alex had his hand in everything, and people were beginning to see the cracks in the family's empire. As investigators dug deeper into Alex's personal and professional life, they uncovered a shocking web of lies. In September 2021, Alex admitted to hiring a hitman to kill him in a botched suicide attempt. He claimed it was part of a life insurance scheme to secure money for his surviving son, Buster. The scheme had backfired. Alex's financial troubles and the pressure from the investigation led to the stunning revelation that Alex had orchestrated the murders of his wife and son. In his confession, Alex claimed that he had shot them to end their suffering, though many still question the validity of his statement. In July 2022, Alex Murdaugh was indicted for the murders of Maggie and Paul. His arrest shocked the community, and the Murdaugh family's once pristine reputation was irreparably shattered. The trial of Alex Murdaugh began in early 2023. The prosecution laid out a damning case, presenting evidence of Alex's financial crimes, his lies about the murders, and his complicated history with his family. The defense, however, argued that Alex had been wrongfully accused and that there was no concrete evidence linking him to the crime. The trial was a spectacle, with the Murdaugh name still carrying weight in the courtroom, but the evidence was overwhelming. Alex Murdaugh was convicted of the murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh. On March 2, 2023, Alex Murdaugh was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of his wife and son. The case, once a tragedy, became a story of greed, power, and corruption, a tale that would forever haunt the Murdaugh name. The legacy of the Murdaugh family has been shattered, leaving behind a trail of devastation and broken lives. What seemed like a story of privilege and power turned out to be a darker tale of betrayal and murder. Texas. In 2001, Andrea Yates made headlines for committing one of the most tragic and controversial acts of the 21st century, the drowning of her 5 children. This case captivated the nation, not just because of the horrifying nature of the crime, but because of the complex questions it raised about mental illness, motherhood, and the criminal justice system. Andrea Yates was born in 1964 in Texas. She grew up in a conservative religious household and showed early signs of being a bright, capable woman. After graduating from high school, she attended the University of Texas, where she studied nursing. It was there that she met Rusty Yates, a fellow student, and the two quickly fell in love. They married in 1993, and soon after, Andrea became a mother. However, beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect family, there were significant struggles. Andrea had long struggled with mental health issues, but it wasn't until after the birth of her first child, Noah, in 1994, that things began to unravel. She was diagnosed with postpartum depression, a serious mental health condition that affects some women after childbirth. But as time went on, her depression grew deeper, and it was evident that Andrea was not getting the help she needed. Andrea gave birth to her second son, John, in 1995. By this time, her mental health was deteriorating rapidly. She suffered from severe postpartum depression, anxiety, and even psychotic episodes. After John's birth, Andrea attempted, and she was hospitalized. Rusty, however, was determined to have a large family and insisted they continue having children. Over the next few years, Andrea gave birth to 3 more children, Paul, Luke, and Mary. Each time her mental state worsened. Andrea's depression deepened into full-blown psychosis, and she became convinced that she was an unfit mother, unworthy of raising her children. Her delusions were amplified by her religious beliefs, which became more extreme. She believed that her children were going to hell, and that the only way to save them was to kill them. On June 20th, 2001, Andrea Yates took this belief to its tragic conclusion. She waited for Rusty to leave the house, and then, one by one, she methodically drowned her 5 children in a bathtub. After the murders, Andrea didn't flee or try to cover up her crime. Instead, she called Rusty at work and told him what she had done. She then called 911, stating, "I killed my children." When the police arrived, Andrea was sitting calmly in the living room, her demeanor detached and emotionless, almost as if she were in a daze. The police quickly arrested Andrea, and she was charged with 5 counts of murder. The media frenzy surrounding the case was immediate. Many people were shocked by the crime, but even more were divided over what should happen to Andrea. Was she a cold-blooded killer, or was she a woman so mentally ill that she couldn't be held responsible for her actions? Andrea's trial began in 2002. The defense argued that she was severely mentally ill at the time of the killings. They presented evidence that Andrea had been suffering from postpartum psychosis, a rare and severe mental illness that can cause women to lose touch with reality. Her mental state at the time of the killings was central to the case. Experts testified that Andrea believed she was saving her children from eternal damnation by killing them. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They argued that Andrea was sane at the time of the murders, that she knew what she was doing and had planned the killings. They suggested that she may have been motivated by a desire to escape her responsibilities as a mother, rather than by a genuine belief that her children were in danger. The jury ultimately found Andrea Yates guilty of capital murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. However, the case didn't end there. In 2006, after new evidence emerged and questions were raised about the testimony used in her conviction, Andrea's case was re-examined. Key witnesses had testified about her mental state, and the prosecution's case was criticized for using outdated and misleading information. In 2006, a Texas appeals court overturned Andrea's conviction. The court ruled that her conviction had been based on false testimony and that her mental illness had not been adequately taken into account. As a result, Andrea Yates was granted a new trial. In 2006, she was retried and found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a psychiatric hospital where she has remained ever since. Today, Andrea Yates remains in a psychiatric facility, and while she may never be fully well, she has received the mental health care she desperately needed. Rusty Yates, despite the unimaginable tragedy that befell his family, has publicly forgiven Andrea. He has been vocal about the role mental illness played in his wife's actions and has advocated for better mental health care for new mothers. The Andrea Yates case remains one of the most tragic and complex criminal cases in American history. It raises uncomfortable questions about the intersection of mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the justice system. And it serves as a stark reminder of the devastating impact untreated mental illness can have on families. Utah. Lori Vallow, a mother of two, and her new husband, Chad Daybell, became the focus of an investigation that would unravel a dark and twisted tale. In 2019, Lori's two children, 7-year-old JJ Vallow and 17-year-old Tylee Ryan, were reported missing by concerned family members. JJ's grandparents, Kay and Larry Woodcock, raised alarm when they hadn't heard from him for months. Tylee's family also grew suspicious, but Lori and Chad weren't exactly cooperating. The couple had moved to Idaho, leaving behind their families, and soon it became clear that something wasn't right. Lori was seen publicly with Chad, but there was no sign of the children. In fact, Lori didn't seem to care much about their absence. Police later discovered that Lori had lied about the children's whereabouts multiple times, and that's when things really began to unravel. Lori and Chad had become entangled in a belief system that was unorthodox, to say the least. Chad, a self-published author, wrote books about the afterlife and end times prophecies. Lori, who was married several times before, met Chad in 2018. It wasn't long before they began sharing a strange, shared belief in the concept of zombies, people who had lost their spiritual essence and became dangerous. In their eyes, certain people around them had turned into these zombies, including Lori's children. They believed that Tylee and JJ were somehow possessed and needed to be removed. At the same time, Lori was becoming more distant from her family, including her brother Alex Cox, who played an increasingly sinister role in the unfolding story. Before the children's disappearance, Lori's ex-husband, Charles Vallow, was shot and killed by Alex Cox in what he claimed was an act of self-defense. However, many believed it was part of Lori's plan to remove obstacles standing in her way. Charles had been concerned about Lori's mental state, especially her growing obsession with Chad and her beliefs. Meanwhile, Chad's previous wife, Tammy Daybell, was also found dead in October 2019 under suspicious circumstances. Initially, her death was ruled natural, but after the discovery of the children's disappearance, authorities began to investigate her death further. In 2020, after the children were found, Tammy's death was reclassified as a homicide. In November 2019, after Lori and Chad refused to cooperate with investigators, authorities issued a warrant for the couple's arrest. On June 9, 2020, JJ's remains were found in a wooded area on Chad Daybell's property. A day later, Tylee's remains were also discovered nearby. The discovery of the children's bodies was horrifying. They had been buried in shallow graves, and it was clear that they had been dead for months before they were found. Lori and Chad had kept up their charade, even holding a memorial for the children, while their remains were lying just yards away. The investigation into the deaths of JJ and Tylee led to the arrests of Lori and Chad. Lori was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder conspiracy to commit murder, and grand theft, among other charges. Chad faced similar charges, including the murder of his first wife, Tammy. In early 2021, Alex Cox, who had been involved in the deaths of Charles and Tammy, mysteriously died from what authorities called natural causes. However, his sudden death only added to the eerie, suspicious nature of the entire case. Lori and Chad's trial began in 2023, and the shocking details of the case emerged. The prosecution painted a picture of a couple who were willing to go to any lengths, including murder, to satisfy their twisted religious beliefs. The defense tried to argue that Lori's mental state was compromised, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. The case continues to leave people in shock, not just because of the tragic deaths, but because of the bizarre religious beliefs that played a role in the murders. Families across the nation were left grappling with the senseless deaths of two innocent children whose lives were tragically cut short by the actions of their own mother and her new husband. In 2023, Lori was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and Chad Daybell was sentenced to death. Lori and Chad's case will likely be remembered as one of the most disturbing stories in recent criminal history. Vermont. In March 2012, Melissa Jenkins, a 33-year-old mother and schoolteacher from St. Johnsbury, Vermont, went missing under mysterious circumstances. Her body was discovered a week later, and what followed was a shocking and twisted tale of betrayal and murder. Melissa's disappearance sent ripples through her community. She was a beloved teacher, an active member of the community, and a devoted mother to her young son. Her sudden absence seemed inexplicable. Her friends and family immediately feared something was terribly wrong. It wasn't until March 19, 2012, that her body was discovered in the Connecticut River, roughly 5 miles from her home. The discovery was made after an extensive search, but what the authorities found would raise more questions than answers. The investigation began quickly, but it wasn't clear how Melissa had ended up in the river. The authorities soon realized that there was something more sinister at play. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to her head, and there was evidence of a violent struggle. Melissa had been last seen leaving her home on March 18th, telling a friend she was meeting someone to talk. But who was this person, and why hadn't she returned home? These were the questions authorities needed to answer, and quickly. As investigators dug deeper, a disturbing connection came to light. Melissa had an ex-boyfriend named Brian Charette. They had broken up months earlier, but they had maintained some level of contact, largely due to their shared custody of Melissa's young son. Brian Charette quickly became a person of interest. Melissa had been in contact with him shortly before her disappearance. They had argued in the past, and it seemed that there was unresolved tension between them. But investigators needed more. The breakthrough came when authorities focused on Brian's vehicle. They found blood inside his car that matched Melissa's DNA. This revelation shifted the investigation in a new direction. Brian was arrested and charged with her murder. It was soon revealed that Brian had become increasingly jealous and obsessive after the breakup. Melissa had begun dating someone new, and Brian couldn't cope with it. He wanted to rekindle their relationship, but she had moved on. On the day of her disappearance, Melissa had arranged to meet Brian under the guise of discussing their son's custody arrangements. But what was meant to be a peaceful meeting turned violent. Brian, in a fit of rage, attacked her. He struck her repeatedly, and she died from blunt force trauma to her head. During his trial, the prosecution presented a chilling case. They argued that Brian had planned the murder and that they had evidence to support this claim. Not only had he attacked Melissa, but he had disposed of her body in the river, hoping to cover up his crime. In the end, the jury found Brian Charette guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison for the brutal killing of Melissa Jenkins. Her son, left without his mother, would have to grow up without the woman who had been his whole world. The murder of Melissa Jenkins shook the small town of St. Johnsbury, leaving a lasting scar. Her death reminded the community that even in peaceful places, tragedy can strike unexpectedly. Melissa's family and friends continue to honor her memory, and her son grows up surrounded by love and support, though he will never fully escape the pain of losing his mother. Melissa Jenkins may be gone, but she is not forgotten. Her story is a tragic reminder of how quickly a life can be taken, and how even the closest relationships can be deceiving. Virginia. On September 13, 2014, 18-year-old Hannah Graham, a student at the University of Virginia, went out with friends in Charlottesville, Virginia. The night was supposed to be just another fun night out, but it would end in tragedy. Around 1 a.m. after leaving a party, Hannah was seen walking alone through the streets. She was headed towards her apartment, but never made it. Security footage shows her walking near a bar seemingly lost. Her friends later reported that they lost contact with her, and by the time they realized something was wrong, it was too late. The next morning, when Hannah didn't return home, her parents grew worried. The authorities were alerted, and a massive search began. Local police, along with volunteers and search dogs, combed the area, hoping to find her. The search was urgent as it became clear Hannah had vanished without a trace. Meanwhile, police had begun to review surveillance footage from around the city. They discovered something chilling. Hannah had been captured on camera in the company of a man. The man seen with Hannah in this footage was identified as 32-year-old Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr. He was a hospital worker from Charlottesville, and his movements that night seemed suspicious. As investigators dug deeper, they realized that Matthew had been near Hannah earlier in the evening. The police traced his movements, and it turned out that he had been seen following Hannah as she wandered alone through the streets. By all appearances, he had been deliberately stalking her. As the investigation continued, it became apparent that Matthew wasn't just a random suspect. In 2005, a young woman named Morgan Harrington had gone missing after attending a concert at the University of Virginia. Her remains were discovered 3 years later, and DNA evidence eventually linked her case to Jesse Matthew. The connection raised even more alarms. Was he a serial offender? Did his history of violent crime extend beyond Hannah and Morgan? On October 1st, 2014, after nearly 3 weeks of searching, police made a significant breakthrough. Jesse Matthew was arrested in Galveston, Texas. He had fled the area but was tracked down after authorities identified him through DNA samples found at the scene of Morgan Harrington's murder. Matthew was charged with abduction with intent to defile. As the case progressed, investigators found that he had taken Hannah's phone and used it to make calls, further implicating him in her disappearance. On October 18, 2014, after Jesse Matthews' arrest, a body was discovered in a remote area of Albemarle County, Virginia. Authorities confirmed it was Hannah Graham. The body was found several miles from where she was last seen. The news of her death sent shockwaves through the community. What was supposed to be a typical night out for a college student had turned into a nightmare. In 2016, Jesse Matthews stood trial for the murder of Hannah Graham. The evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA evidence linked him to the crime scene, and his actions the night of her disappearance were reconstructed with chilling accuracy. Matthew pleaded guilty to her murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the trial, it was revealed that he had a long history of violence against women, but he was never fully held accountable until after Hannah's death. Hannah's murder deeply impacted the community of Charlottesville and beyond. Her family, especially her parents, were left to cope with the devastating loss of a bright young woman with so much potential. In the wake of her death, there were calls for increased security measures on college campuses and a more comprehensive approach to preventing violence against women. Hannah's story is a painful reminder of how one night can change everything, but it also sparked important conversations about safety, justice, and accountability. While Hannah's life was tragically cut short, her family and friends continue to honor her memory. Washington. In the early 1980s, a quiet and peaceful city in the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, Washington, would unknowingly become the hunting grounds for one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. For years, the Green River Killer evaded capture, leaving a trail of tragedy in his wake. It all started in 1982 when the body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield was discovered near the Green River. The discovery set off a series of events that would shake the community to its core. Within weeks, the bodies of other young women began turning up along the river's banks. All of them had one thing in common. They were adult workers, and they were found strangled. Over the next 5 years, the Green River Killer claimed the lives of at least 49 women. The police were stumped, and the killer's cold, calculated methods, strangling his victims and leaving their bodies in remote wooded areas, made it clear that they were dealing with a methodical predator. In 1984, the case went cold. The authorities struggled to make progress. The killer was elusive, and the victims' lives were often treated with indifference by the media. But then, in 1985, a major break came. Gary Ridgway, a truck painter, was arrested in connection with the murder. But Ridgway was released when they couldn't connect him to the murders. He was, at the time, just one of many suspects, but the police would circle back to him years later. Born in 1949, Gary Ridgway grew up in a family full of tension and dysfunction. His mother was overbearing and critical, while his father was emotionally distant. These early experiences seemed to have a lasting effect on Ridgway. Ridgway, as an adult, had trouble forming meaningful relationships with women. His marriages were troubled, and his obsessions would later come to define him. His frustration with women and his twisted need to dominate them led to his horrific killing spree. The victims were often vulnerable women, working as adult workers along the highways of Seattle. Many of them struggled with addiction or homelessness, which made it easier for Ridgway to lure them into his truck. Once he had them in his vehicle, he would take them to secluded locations and strangle them. The Green River was where many of the bodies were found, but not all of them. Ridgway's reach extended far beyond the river banks. His killing field stretched across Washington state, making it all the more difficult for authorities to track him down. In the late 1980s, the investigation hit a dead end. That was until DNA technology advanced in the 1990s. For the first time, investigators could use genetic evidence to connect a suspect to a crime scene. A breakthrough came in 2001 when DNA linked Ridgway to the murder of several victims. Ridgway had been living right under the police's nose, working as a truck painter in the same city where the murders took place. He had been a suspect for years, but now, with DNA evidence tying him to the crimes, investigators had the proof they needed. On November 30th, 2001, Gary Ridgway was arrested and charged with the murders of 4 women. As the investigation continued, Ridgway's confession became a chilling account of his life of crimes. Ridgway confessed to killing 71 women over a span of 20 years. However, due to his guilty plea and cooperation, many of the cases remained unsolved. In 2003, Ridgway pled guilty to 48 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His confession revealed the depth of his depravity, and he took investigators to the locations of some of the victims' remains. He offered no remorse for his actions, only cold, calculated descriptions of his murders. Ridgway's capture and conviction brought some measure of closure to the families of the victims, but the true scale of his crimes is still chilling. The Green River Killer had been a phantom for decades, evading capture while causing unimaginable pain and loss. Gary Ridgway's story is one of darkness and horror, but it also stands as a reminder that sometimes justice comes when it's least expected, when the past catches up with the present and the truth finally comes to light. West Virginia. In the small town of Star City, West Virginia, the peaceful and tight-knit community was rocked by a crime so shocking that it would grab national headlines. Skylar Neese was 16 years old when she disappeared in the summer of 2012. She had everything ahead of her, an outgoing, friendly teenager known for her bubbly personality. She lived with her parents, Dave and Mary Neese, and had a close-knit group of friends. But behind the seemingly normal life, Skylar was keeping secrets, especially from her parents. Skylar's 2 best friends, Rachel Schoaf and Sheila Eddy, were the center of her world. They hung out together at school, shared the usual teenage experiences, and lived their lives in the small town with an unspoken bond. But beneath the surface, things weren't as they seemed. Skylar had started to drift away from her friends, growing more distant and often keeping to herself. She began to express her frustrations to her parents, especially about her friendships with Rachel and Sheila. Skylar's parents noticed the tension, but never imagined it would lead to something far worse. On the night of July 6th, 2012, Skylar went to bed like any other night, seemingly preparing for another day of summer fun. But as the night went on, Skylar made a decision that would change everything. She snuck out of her house around midnight. Her parents had no idea. Skylar had texted Sheila and Rachel that she was coming over to hang out. They picked her up in the middle of the night around 12:30 a.m. The plan was simple: drive around for a bit, maybe go to a party. But Skylar didn't return home that night. When Skylar didn't return, her parents were frantic. They called the police, and soon a search began. But there was something odd about her disappearance. Skylar's phone, her belongings, and all traces of her seemed to vanish. At first, authorities treated it like a typical missing persons case, but as days passed, the situation grew darker. Skylar had been friends with Rachel and Sheila for years, but now both girls were acting strange, avoiding questions, being vague in their answers. As the investigation continued, police began to dig deeper into the girls' lives. The breakthrough came when Rachel Schoaf broke down under intense questioning. She revealed the horrifying truth. She and Sheila had plotted Skylar's murder. But what led them to this? In the months before Skylar's death, both Rachel and Sheila had been growing more and more resentful of her. Skylar had become distant from them, and according to Rachel, Sheila was the one who first suggested they kill Skylar. It was supposed to be a simple plan: get rid of her and not get caught. On the night of July 6th, after picking up Skylar, the three drove out into the woods, just a short distance from their town. What happened next was chilling. Skylar, unaware of the horror awaiting her, was dragged out of the car and into the woods. Rachel and Sheila then stabbed her repeatedly. They left Skylar's body there, hoping it would never be found. But the police weren't ready to give up. They scoured the area for weeks, and after Rachel's confession, authorities found Skylar's body in a remote part of the woods, not far from where she was last seen. The investigation into Rachel and Sheila's motives revealed that while Skylar's murder was premeditated, it was fueled by a mix of jealousy and resentment. Skylar had become more distant from her friends, and the bond between Sheila and Rachel was stronger than ever. But neither of them thought through their consequences of their actions. It was only after Rachel's confession that the true horror of what had happened came to light. In the months following the murder, both girls were arrested and tried for their roles in Skylar's death. Rachel pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Sheila, on the other hand, denied any involvement at first, but later changed her plea. In 2013, Sheila was sentenced to life in prison, eligible for parole after 15 years. Skylar Neese's death shocked everyone who knew her, especially her parents. Dave and Mary Neese fought for justice for their daughter, not just in the courts, but by speaking out about the dangers of online relationships and the importance of being aware of the people in your life. Skylar's story serves as a tragic reminder of the darkness that can exist even within the closest of friendships. What was once a peaceful town now had a painful scar, and the lives of those involved would never be the same again. Skylar Neese's story is one that still resonates with so many people today. It's a tragedy that unfolded behind the closed doors of a friendship, and it shows just how much we might not know about the people closest to us. The loss of Skylar is a loss that can never be replaced, but it also serves as a reminder to be vigilant, to trust, and to truly know the people in your life. Wisconsin. In 1985, Stephen Avery was a 23-year-old man living in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. His life, already marked by a few run-ins with the law, was about to change dramatically. Avery had been convicted of a brutal crime that he insisted he didn't commit. He was sentenced to 32 years in prison, but then, in 2003, something extraordinary happened. After spending 18 years behind bars, Stephen Avery's conviction was overturned. DNA testing, which hadn't been available during his trial, proved his innocence. The real culprit, a man named Gregory Allen, was identified, and Avery was released. It was a rare moment of justice. For Avery, the world had finally righted itself. But the story wasn't over. In fact, the darkest chapter of his life was about to begin. Less than 2 years later, in 2005, tragedy struck again. Teresa Halbach, a 25-year-old photographer, went missing. She had been sent to the Avery property to take pictures of a vehicle for an Auto Trader magazine. Her car was later found on the property, and the investigation led authorities to Stephen Avery. Avery was arrested for her murder. He denied involvement, but evidence soon started to stack up against him. Police claimed that they found Halbach's blood in his garage. The prosecution also pointed to human remains found on the Avery property that were identified as Halbach's. It appeared that Avery, just months after being exonerated, had committed another heinous crime. But from the beginning, Avery's defense team argued that he was framed. They pointed out numerous inconsistencies in the investigation. For one, they questioned why the police hadn't sealed off the property or properly gathered evidence. They also suggested that the Manitowoc County officers had a motive to set Avery up. After all, Avery had sued the county for wrongful conviction, and he was about to win a hefty sum of money. There were also allegations of planted evidence. A key piece of evidence was a bullet found in Avery's garage, which the prosecution claimed had Halbach's DNA on it, but the defense pointed out that this bullet had not been properly handled and that it could have been planted. The case took a bizarre twist when a documentary filmmaker began filming the investigation. Their documentary, Making a Murderer, would bring the story of Stephen Avery to millions of viewers and raise questions about the integrity of the justice system. Making a Murderer focused not just on Avery, but also on his nephew, Brendan Dassey, who was arrested in connection with the crime. Dassey, a teenager with a limited intellectual capacity, gave a confession that many people, including legal experts, later argued was coerced by the police. Dassey's confession was riddled with inconsistencies, and many believe that he was manipulated into implicating himself and his uncle. Brendan Dassey's story became central to the case. His confession, given without the presence of an attorney or guardian, was later deemed questionable by many. His defense team argued that Dassey had been pressured and tricked into making false statements. Still, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. In 2007, Stephen Avery was convicted of the murder of Teresa Halbach. The jury believed the evidence, despite the defense's arguments. Avery was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the story didn't end there. In 2016, new developments brought hope for Avery's supporters. His legal team uncovered what they believed was evidence that could potentially exonerate him, including DNA testing that could link someone else to the crime scene. The case of Stephen Avery raised larger questions about the criminal justice system. How reliable is forensic evidence? Can people be wrongfully convicted? And how many other cases are there where people like Avery have been denied justice? To this day, Stephen Avery remains in prison, fighting for a new trial, while Brendan Dassey's case continues to be a point of contention, with some pushing for his release. Whether or not Avery will ever be exonerated and whether Dassey will be freed remains uncertain. The story of Stephen Avery is a story of both justice and tragedy, one that continues to unfold in the courts and in the public eye. And just a side note, that documentary was nonsense. He's guilty, in my opinion. Wyoming. In the quiet hills of Wyoming, two killers lived side by side for decades, as husband and wife. But the most shocking part, they each committed murder separately and long before they met. This is the story of Gerald and Alice Uden and the dark family secrets they buried in the wilderness. In September 1980, Gerald Uden lured his ex-wife Virginia and her 2 young sons, Richard and Reagan, on a supposed hunting trip. They never returned. Motivated by money and a desire to cut ties with his past, Gerald shot all 3 in cold blood, his former wife and her children. He loaded their bodies into his car and drove them deep into the wilderness, dumping them in an abandoned mine shaft. With no witnesses and no recovered bodies, the case went cold. Gerald moved on, starting a new life with a woman named Alice. But Alice Uden had her own secret. Years earlier in 1974, Alice shot her 3rd husband, Ronald Holtz, in the back of the head while he slept. She stuffed his body into a 55-gallon barrel, then hid it in an abandoned mine near Laramie. She told people he'd run off and never looked back. No one questioned it. Decades later, in 2013, cold case investigators reopened Holtz's file. The barrel was found inside Ronald's remains, almost perfectly preserved. Confronted with the evidence, Alice confessed. That confession triggered renewed attention on her husband Gerald, and soon he too confessed, admitting to killing Virginia and her sons all those years ago. In 2014, Alice Uden was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. She died behind bars in 2019. Gerald Uden received 3 life sentences. He remains in prison, unrepentant. 2 killers, bound by marriage and blood. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you will know each time we upload a new video. Be sure to check out our playlists for more chilling content to help fall asleep. While you're there, be sure to hit the like button and leave us a comment down below. Until next time, stay curious.